Welcome, weary travelers of the endless seas, to a solemn chronicle of sacrifice and loss that has shaped the very foundations of the pirate world. Tonight, we honor those whose final moments echo through history, whose deaths became legends, whose sacrifices carved the path for dreams yet to be fulfilled. These are not mere endings, but transformations, souls whose departure from this world ignited flames that continue to burn in the hearts of those who remember. Let the gentle rhythm of sorrowful waves carry you into peaceful rest as we pay tribute to the fallen heroes whose stories deserve to be told in hushed, reverent tones. The death that ignited the flames of an entire era began not with the swing of an executioner's blade, but with the quiet resignation of a man who had conquered everything the world had to offer, only to discover that his greatest victory would be his final defeat. Gol D. Roger, the King of Pirates, the only soul to have reached the legendary final island of Laughtale, carried within his body a sentence more absolute than any judge could pronounce: the slow, inexorable advance of an incurable disease that would claim his life, regardless of his legendary strength or indomitable will. The irony was not lost on Roger himself. This man who had sailed every ocean and faced every danger the Grand Line could conjure, that his ultimate enemy would be invisible, attacking from within the very flesh that had carried him to glory. The symptoms had begun subtly during his final voyage, moments of weakness that he attributed to exhaustion, dizzy spells that he dismissed as the natural consequence of a life lived at full intensity. But as the months passed and his condition worsened, even Roger could no longer deny the truth that his ship's doctor, Crocus, delivered with professional gravity, tempered by personal anguish. The disease that coursed through Roger's veins was beyond the reach of any medicine, any devil fruit power, any miracle that the strange world of pirates and marines might offer. It was a countdown written in failing organs and weakening muscles, a biological clock that ticked toward an ending that no amount of haki or determination could postpone. Yet rather than despair or rage against the cosmic unfairness of his situation, Roger found himself filled with something approaching relief, the recognition that his story would have a conclusion worthy of the legend he had become. The decision to surrender himself to the Marines was not born of despair, but of strategic brilliance that would reshape the world more profoundly than any battle he had ever fought. Roger understood that his death was inevitable, but the manner of his dying remained within his control, and in that control lay the power to craft a legacy that would outlive not just his body, but potentially the very world government that sought to claim credit for his capture. The man who had spent his life defying authority would perform one final act of rebellion by giving his enemies exactly what they thought they wanted, while ensuring that his surrender served purposes they could never comprehend. The months following his decision were marked by a strange serenity that surprised even those closest to him. Rayleigh, his first mate and most trusted friend, watched with a mixture of admiration and heartbreak as Roger approached his fate with the same fearless curiosity that had driven him to explore unknown islands and challenge impossible odds. There was no bravado in Roger's acceptance of death, no theatrical gesturing or artificial drama, simply the quiet dignity of someone who had lived fully and was prepared to die with equal completeness. The journey to his surrender was undertaken not as a desperate flight from justice, but as a final voyage, one last opportunity to see the world he had spent his life exploring. Roger visited islands that held special meaning, said farewells to old friends and bitter enemies with equal grace, and settled affairs both practical and emotional with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood that loose ends, once left untied, could never be properly knotted. His crew, those stalwart companions who had shared his greatest adventures, were disbanded, not through defeat or dissolution, but through his deliberate choice to spare them the pain of watching their captain march toward his execution. The world government's reaction to Roger's surrender was a complex mixture of triumph and suspicion, the recognition that they had achieved something unprecedented, tempered by the nagging certainty that Roger never did anything without purpose. Fleet Admiral Sengoku and the other high-ranking officials who participated in the planning of Roger's execution understood that they were dealing with a man whose intelligence matched his strength, whose strategic thinking had consistently outmaneuvered their best efforts to capture him. The fact that he had delivered himself into their hands suggested possibilities they found simultaneously exciting and terrifying. The location chosen for Roger's execution carried symbolic weight that was not lost on anyone involved in its selection. Logtown, Roger's birthplace, would become the site of his death, the circle of his existence closing in the most poetically appropriate manner possible. The platform that was constructed for the occasion rose above the town square like an altar of justice, its wooden beams designed to support not just the weight of the condemned, but the expectations of a world that would witness the end of the most notorious pirate in history. The news of Roger's impending execution spread across the oceans like wildfire, carried by news coups to every island, every ship, every corner of civilization where people gathered to hear tales of the wider world. Pirates who had spent years fleeing from Roger's reputation found themselves drawn to witness his end. Marines who had dedicated careers to his capture prepared for a moment of vindication that had seemed impossible to achieve, and ordinary citizens who had heard whispered stories of his exploits gathered to see whether legends could truly die like ordinary men. The morning of Roger's execution dawned clear and bright, as if the world itself were providing perfect conditions for this historic moment. The crowd that assembled in Logtown's central square was unlike anything the town had ever hosted. A mixture of Marines in dress uniform, pirates trying to blend into the civilian population, journalists documenting every detail for posterity, and common folk who simply wanted to witness history being made. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation, the kind of charged silence that precedes moments of such significance that they divide time itself into before and after. Roger's walk to the execution platform was conducted with ceremony befitting his status, not as a common criminal, but as a figure whose death would mark the end of an era. He moved through the crowd without shackles or restraints beyond those necessary to maintain the illusion that he was truly a prisoner rather than a willing participant in his own execution. His bearing remained regal despite his circumstances, his head held high as he surveyed the faces of those who had gathered to watch him die, reading in their expressions the full spectrum of human emotion, from hatred to admiration, to simple curiosity about what a legend looked like when stripped of mythology and reduced to mortal flesh. The executioner's platform loomed above him like a stage set for the performance of his lifetime, the final act of a drama that had played out across every ocean and involved every major power in the world. As Roger climbed the steps that would carry him to his death, each footfall seemed to echo with the weight of history, the sound of a man approaching not just his personal ending, but the conclusion of everything that his life had represented to those who had followed his exploits with fascination, fear, or admiration. The questions that were shouted from the crowd as Roger took his position before the executioners reflected the burning curiosity that had surrounded his legend throughout his career. Where was his treasure? What secrets had he discovered on the final island? What drove a man to risk everything in pursuit of dreams that most people would dismiss as impossible fantasies? The reporters present understood that they were witnessing a moment that would define how history remembered not just Roger, but the entire age of piracy that his career had exemplified. Roger's response to these questions would prove to be the most consequential words ever spoken by a dying man, syllables that would reshape the world's political landscape and inspire a generation of dreamers to risk everything in pursuit of possibilities they had never dared to imagine. The smile that played across his face as he prepared to speak was not the grimace of a man facing death, but the expression of someone who was about to play his final card in a game that had lasted his entire adult life, a move that would checkmate opponents who thought they had already won. The declaration that his treasure, the One Piece, could be found by anyone with the strength and determination to reach the end of the Grand Line was delivered with the casual confidence of someone stating an obvious fact rather than making a revolutionary announcement. But the impact of those words was immediate and transformative, rippling through the crowd like an earthquake that shook the very foundations of the established order. Pirates who had been content with small-scale raiding suddenly began dreaming of ultimate prizes. Young people who had never considered lives of adventure found themselves questioning the limitations of their current existence, and the world government officials who had orchestrated this execution realized with growing horror that they had provided Roger with the perfect platform for the greatest act of rebellion in human history. The great pirate era that began with Roger's death was not an unintended consequence of his execution, but its deliberate purpose. The final strategy of a man who understood that his individual death could serve as the catalyst for changes that his individual life, however legendary, could never have achieved. By transforming his execution from a demonstration of government power into an advertisement for the dreams he represented, Roger ensured that his influence would only grow stronger in death, that every young person who heard his final words would carry within themselves a seed of the rebellion that had defined his existence. The moment of his actual death was almost anticlimactic after the earth-shaking impact of his final declaration, the swift descent of the executioner's blades seeming insufficient to contain or conclude a life that had operated on such an epic scale. But Roger faced his end with the same fearless curiosity that had driven his greatest adventures, his eyes remaining open until the final moment, as if he were eager to discover what lay beyond the threshold that no living person had ever crossed and returned to describe. The silence that followed Roger's death lasted only seconds before being shattered by the roar of a crowd whose understanding of the world had been fundamentally altered by what they had witnessed. Some cheered the end of a notorious criminal, others mourned the passing of a romantic figure, but most simply stood in stunned recognition that they had witnessed something unprecedented, a death that felt more like a birth, an ending that was simultaneously a beginning of something vast and unpredictable. The world government's immediate recognition that Roger's execution had backfired spectacularly was evident in the frantic efforts to contain and control the narrative that emerged from Logtown. Official statements attempted to frame his final words as the desperate boasts of a dying criminal, propaganda designed to minimize the inspirational impact of his declaration that anyone could follow in his footsteps and claim the ultimate prize. But these efforts to diminish Roger's final message only served to amplify it, the government's obvious concern lending credibility to claims they desperately wanted the world to dismiss. The transformation that began with Roger's death extended far beyond the immediate surge in piracy that his words inspired, reaching into the fundamental structures of power and authority that governed human civilization. The world government, which had ruled through a combination of military might and the general population's acceptance that their authority was inevitable, suddenly found themselves confronting a different kind of challenge, the spreading belief that alternatives were possible, that individual will and determination could overcome even the most entrenched systems of control. Roger's legacy lived not in monuments or memorials, but in the actions of those who heard his final words and chose to believe that dreams were worth pursuing, regardless of the obstacles that stood in their way. Every pirate who set sail in search of the One Piece carried with them a fragment of Roger's rebellion. Every young person who rejected the limitations of their birth circumstances honored his memory, and every act of defiance against unjust authority served as proof that his death had achieved exactly what he intended. The mystery that surrounded the One Piece itself became part of Roger's enduring influence, the unknown nature of his treasure, ensuring that people would continue to project their own hopes and dreams onto whatever lay waiting at the end of the Grand Line. Whether the treasure was gold or knowledge or something else entirely mattered less than the fact that it represented possibility, the chance that the world contained wonders worth any sacrifice to discover, that life held meanings deeper than mere survival or comfort. The impact of Roger's execution would continue to reverberate through history, long after the platform in Logtown had been dismantled and the crowd had dispersed to carry their memories of that day to every corner of the world. His death marked not the end of the golden age of piracy, but its true beginning. The moment when piracy transformed from mere criminal enterprise into something approaching a philosophy, a way of life that rejected conventional limitations in favor of unlimited possibility. Standing in Logtown Square in the moments after the executioner's work was done, surrounded by the chaos of a crowd whose worldview had just been shattered and rebuilt, witnesses to Roger's death understood that they had seen more than the end of a notorious criminal's life. They had watched the birth of a new age, the beginning of a story that would continue to unfold long after they themselves had joined Roger in whatever realm awaited beyond the final voyage that every soul must eventually undertake. In the quiet moments before dawn broke over Batarilla Island, when the world still held its breath between night and day, Port-Gas-D, Rouge carried within her womb not just an unborn child but the future itself, wrapped in flesh and blood, and the kind of love that could defy the natural order of existence. The woman who had captured the heart of the Pirate King possessed a strength that went far beyond physical endurance, a determination so profound that it would reshape the very boundaries of what human will could accomplish when motivated by the purest form of maternal devotion. Rouge had always been remarkable, though in ways that the world would never properly recognize or celebrate. Her beauty was not the kind that launched ships or started wars, but rather the quiet radiance of someone who understood that true strength lay in gentleness, that real power resided in the ability to nurture rather than destroy. She possessed the rare wisdom of those who find meaning, not in conquest, but in creation, not in taking, but in giving, not in leaving marks upon the world, but in shaping the souls who would carry forward whatever goodness she could instill within them. The love that had blossomed between Rouge and Roger was unlike anything either had experienced in lives already rich with adventure and profound relationships. Theirs was not the passionate romance of youth or the convenient partnership of those who found mutual benefit in alliance, but something deeper and more transformative, the recognition of souls who complemented each other in ways that made both more complete than they had ever been alone. Roger, who had conquered every sea and faced every danger the world could offer, discovered in Rouge's presence a peace that all his victories had failed to provide. Their time together had been precious precisely because both understood its temporary nature, Roger's illness casting over their happiness the shadow of inevitable separation that made every shared moment more valuable than treasure. They spoke of the future in careful hypotheticals, building dreams they knew would likely never be fulfilled, while finding joy in the simple act of imagining possibilities that transcended the harsh realities of Roger's deteriorating condition and the world's relentless pursuit of everything connected to his legend. The discovery of her pregnancy came at a time when Roger's condition was worsening rapidly, his body beginning to fail in ways that made clear that his remaining time could be measured in months rather than years. The joy they felt at this unexpected blessing was immediately complicated by the recognition of what this child would inherit. Not just Roger's bloodline, but the world government's eternal enmity, the burden of carrying a name that would make them a target before they drew their first breath. Roger's decision to surrender himself to the Marines was influenced not just by his desire to control his own death, but by his recognition that his continued existence posed a threat to both Rouge and their unborn child. As long as he remained free, the government's resources would be focused on his capture, but his death might provide the distraction necessary for his family to disappear into whatever anonymity was still possible, in a world where his name had become synonymous with everything the authorities feared most. The conversations between Roger and Rouge during his final weeks were marked by a tenderness that seemed almost sacred. The sharing of hopes and fears and promises between two people who understood that they were living through the conclusion of their time together. Roger spoke to her belly with the wonder of someone who had never expected to experience fatherhood, telling stories of his adventures to an audience who could not yet hear, but who would one day need these tales to understand the legacy they inherited. Rouge's promise to protect their child came not as a dramatic vow, but as a simple statement of fact, the kind of absolute commitment that required no elaboration because its sincerity was beyond question. She would do whatever was necessary to ensure that their baby survived to adulthood, would sacrifice anything including her own life if such sacrifice became necessary, would defy nature itself if that defiance served her child's safety and future happiness. After Roger's departure for his final voyage and eventual surrender, Rouge found herself existing in a strange state of suspended animation, her pregnancy proceeding normally while she waited for news of events that would determine both her fate and her child's. The execution at Loguetown, witnessed by the world through newspaper accounts and Den Den Mushi broadcasts, marked not just the end of her beloved's life, but the beginning of the most dangerous period of her own existence. The world government's systematic hunt for anyone connected to Roger's bloodline began almost immediately after his execution. Agents fanning out across every island where he was known to have spent time, questioning anyone who might have information about potential relationships or descendants. The efficiency of their search was terrifying in its thoroughness, the kind of methodical investigation that left few stones unturned and fewer secrets undiscovered. Rouge's isolation on Batarilla became both her protection and her torment, the island's remote location providing sanctuary while its very remoteness meant that any discovery would leave her with nowhere to flee. She watched the horizon daily for ships that might bring either salvation or doom, never knowing whether the next vessel to appear would carry friends or enemies, never able to relax her vigilance because the cost of a single mistake would be measured in lives she valued more than her own. The decision to extend her pregnancy beyond its natural term was not made in a moment of inspiration, but grew gradually from her observation of the intensifying search efforts and her recognition that her child's birth during the Pound's birth, the height of the investigation, would likely prove fatal for them. Both. The physical impossibility of what she contemplated was less relevant than the necessity that drove her consideration, the understanding that conventional limitations meant nothing when weighed against her child's survival. The process of extending her pregnancy required a level of mental and physical control that pushed beyond every boundary of human endurance. The conscious manipulation of biological processes that were designed to proceed according to their own rhythms regardless of external circumstances. Rouge had to maintain not just the physical suspension of her child's development, but the emotional and spiritual strength necessary to endure months of additional strain, while knowing that every day increased the risk of permanent damage to both mother and baby. The loneliness of her extended pregnancy was perhaps more difficult to endure than the physical discomfort. The knowledge that she was undergoing an experience so unprecedented that no one could offer advice or support based on their own understanding. She spoke to her unborn child constantly during these months, sharing stories Roger had told her, singing lullabies that had been passed down through generations of her family, creating a connection that transcended the normal boundaries between mother and baby. The psychological toll of maintaining such absolute control over her body's natural processes manifested in ways both subtle and profound, her personality shifting toward an almost mystical serenity that seemed to separate her from the ordinary concerns of daily existence. Neighbors who had known Rouge for years began to comment on the change in her demeanor, the way she seemed to exist partially in another realm while maintaining enough presence in the physical world to handle the practical necessities of survival. The physical changes that accompanied her extended pregnancy went far beyond the normal discomforts of expectant motherhood, her body struggling to maintain systems that were designed to conclude their processes months earlier. The strain on her organs was enormous, her heart working overtime to support a pregnancy that had exceeded every natural parameter, her skeletal system bearing weight that increased daily as her child continued to develop within an environment that should have released him into the world long ago. Rouge's understanding of what her extended pregnancy was costing her became clearer with each passing week, the recognition that she was trading her life for her child's safety, growing from suspicion to certainty as her body began to show signs of damage that could not be reversed. Yet this knowledge brought not despair but a strange kind of peace, the satisfaction of someone who had found a purpose worthy of any sacrifice and was fulfilling it with complete dedication. The 20 months of pregnancy that Rouge endured were marked by the gradual withdrawal of marine search efforts as the investigators concluded that Roger's bloodline had either been successfully eliminated or had never existed in the Prong's first place. The passage of time worked in her favor as other priorities claimed the government's attention, and the intensity of their hunt for Roger's descendants decreased to more manageable levels. The birth of Goldie Ace, when it finally came, was both triumph and tragedy. The successful conclusion of Rouge's impossible plan coupled with the beginning of her own inevitable decline. The child she had protected for 20 months was healthy and strong, showing no signs of the extended gestation that had preserved his life. But Rouge herself was clearly dying, her body having given everything it possessed to ensure her son's survival. Rouge's final hours were spent not in regret or self-pity, but in the quiet joy of holding the child she had sacrificed everything to protect, studying his features for traces of the man she had loved, while making peace with the knowledge that she would not live to see him grow into whatever destiny awaited him. Her decision to name him Goldie Ace was her final gift to Roger's memory, ensuring that their child would carry his father's initial, even if he could never safely claim the full inheritance of his bloodline. The midwives who attended Rouge during her final labor and witnessed her death understood that they had been present for something unprecedented in human history, a demonstration of maternal love so profound that it had literally reshaped the natural order to serve a child's safety. Their discretion in the aftermath of Ace's birth would prove crucial to his survival. Their willingness to honor Rouge's sacrifice by maintaining the secrets necessary for his protection. Garp's arrival to take custody of the newborn Ace marked the conclusion of Rouge's plan and the beginning of his complicated journey toward adulthood. The Marine hero's own sacrifice in agreeing to raise Roger's son serving as testament to the power of Rouge's example. The woman who had died to give birth to the future Pirate King's heir had inspired even her enemies to acts of compassion that transcended their official duties and personal loyalties. The legacy of Rouge's sacrifice would influence Ace throughout his life, in ways both obvious and subtle. His relationship with his own existence, colored by the knowledge of what his birth had cost. the woman who loved him before she ever saw his face. The 20 months she had carried him beyond nature's intended term became a symbol of the lengths to which love could extend itself when protecting the innocent, a demonstration that some bonds were stronger than death itself. The story of Rouge's extended pregnancy became legend among those few who knew the truth, passed down through generations as an example of what was possible when determination met necessity and love provided the strength to accomplish the impossible. Her death was mourned not as a tragedy, but as the completion of a sacred duty, the fulfillment of a promise that had required nothing less than her entire existence to keep. In the quiet moments when Ace would later struggle with questions about his worth and his right to exist, the memory of Rouge's sacrifice served as irrefutable proof that he had been wanted and loved before he was born, that his life had been purchased with a currency more precious than any treasure the world could offer. The woman he had never known had given him not just life but the foundation upon which he could build whatever future his own choices would create. The maternal love that had sustained Rouge through 20 months of impossible pregnancy continued to influence the world long after her death, inspiring others to acts of protection and sacrifice that honored her memory, while serving the cause of nurturing the innocent. Her example became a template for the kind of devotion that could reshape reality itself when properly applied. A demonstration that love, when sufficiently concentrated and properly directed, could accomplish miracles that defied every rational explanation. Rouge's death marked not just the end of her individual story, but the transformation of her sacrifice into something eternal, a force that would continue to protect and guide her son throughout his journey toward his own destiny. The woman who had died to give him life had ensured that her love would remain with him always, an invisible shield that no enemy could penetrate and no hardship could diminish. The man they called the world's strongest had been dying for years before anyone dared to notice, his massive frame carrying within it the slow decay that comes to all mortals, regardless of how legendary their strength might be. Edward Newgate, known across every ocean as Whitebeard, bore his approaching mortality with the same stoic dignity that had characterized his entire career as one of the four emperors, refusing to acknowledge weakness, even as his body betrayed him with increasing frequency and undeniable clarity. The signs had been accumulating for longer than his crew wanted to admit. Moments of breathlessness that lasted a fraction too long. Tremors in hands that had once been steady enough to split islands. The gradual but perceptible decrease in the devastating power that had made his very name a force capable of ending wars before they began. The medical equipment that had begun appearing around his captain's chair was explained away as precautionary measures, routine health monitoring for a man whose responsibilities required him to remain in peak condition for the sake of those who depended on his protection. Marco, his 1st Division commander, and the closest thing Whitebeard had ever had to a son, watched these changes with the trained eye of someone whose devil fruit powers had given him intimate knowledge of biological systems and their inevitable failures. The Phoenix's regenerative abilities made him acutely aware of damage that could not be healed, deterioration that progressed beyond the reach of any medical intervention or supernatural power. What he observed in his captain filled him with a dread that he dared not voice, the recognition that even legends were subject to the same mortal limitations that claimed every other soul who had ever drawn breath. The secret that Whitebeard carried within his failing heart was not just his own mortality, but the weight of responsibility for hundreds of subordinates whose lives had been shaped around the assumption of his eternal presence. The New World's delicate balance of power rested largely upon the foundation of his reputation, pirates and marines alike calculating their movements based on the presumed inevitability of his retaliation should they threaten anything he had claimed under his protection. His death would create a power vacuum that would destabilize entire regions and likely cost thousands of lives, as various factions moved to claim territories that his mere existence had kept peaceful. The crews that sailed under his flag were more than simple subordinates or temporary allies. They were family members whose loyalty had been earned through decades of protection and guidance. Young pirates who had found in Whitebeard not just a powerful patron, but a father figure whose approval meant more than any treasure or reputation they might claim through their own efforts. The thought of leaving them orphaned in a world that would immediately become more dangerous with his passing was perhaps more painful than any physical symptom his illness could produce. Ace's capture by the world government transformed Whitebeard's private struggle with mortality into a public crisis that would define the final chapter of his legendary career. The young man who had joined his crew as the son of his greatest rival had become as precious to Whitebeard as any blood relative. His defiant spirit and unwavering loyalty earning a place in the old pirate's heart that transcended their lack of biological connection. The news that Ace faced execution created a situation where Whitebeard's personal feelings and his responsibilities as a captain aligned perfectly, making his decision to attempt a rescue not just emotionally necessary but strategically inevitable. The preparation for what would become known as the Marineford War required Whitebeard to marshal resources and coordinate alliances on a scale that hadn't been seen since the conflicts that had established the current world order. Decades earlier, every crew under his protection was called upon to contribute ships and personnel. Old debts were called in from pirates who owed him favors, and neutral parties who respected his reputation were encouraged to remain uninvolved rather than risk finding themselves on the wrong side of his legendary wrath. The physical toll of organizing such a massive military operation, while concealing the extent of his declining health, pushed Whitebeard beyond limits that a younger, healthier man might have struggled to endure. Each planning session, each strategic discussion, each moment of leadership required him to project strength and confidence that became increasingly difficult to maintain as his condition continued to deteriorate. The medications that Marco insisted he take helped manage some symptoms but could not address the fundamental reality that his body was failing him at precisely the moment when he needed it most. The voyage to Marineford was undertaken with the knowledge that it might well be his final journey, the recognition that win or lose, survival or death, this confrontation would likely mark the end of everything he had built over a lifetime dedicated to protecting those who could not protect themselves. The Moby Dick cut through the waves toward the marine stronghold with the inevitability of fate itself, carrying not just a rescue mission but the conclusion of an era that had been defined by the presence of giants among ordinary men. Whitebeard's arrival at Marineford was orchestrated with the theatrical flair that had always characterized his most important appearances. The coating bubble that had concealed his ship's approach, bursting at precisely the right moment to reveal the world's strongest man, standing at the prow of his vessel like an incarnation of divine wrath. The psychological impact of his presence was immediate and profound. Marines who had prepared for battle suddenly confronting the reality of facing someone whose reputation had been built upon decades of seemingly impossible victories. The declaration of war that followed was delivered not with shouted threats or dramatic gesturing, but with the quiet authority of someone whose word had shaped the destinies of nations. His simple statement that he had come for Ace, carrying more weight than any formal military proclamation. The assembled forces of the world government, despite their overwhelming numerical advantage and carefully prepared defensive positions, felt the chill of recognition that they were about to face something unprecedented in the annals of marine history. The early stages of the battle demonstrated that age and illness had diminished, but not eliminated the fearsome power that had made Whitebeard a legend. His devil fruit abilities still capable of reshaping the battlefield with casual applications of force that defied rational understanding. Each earthquake he generated, sent shockwaves through both the physical structure of Marineford and the psychological certainty of those who had hoped that rumors of his declining health meant he could be defeated through conventional military tactics. The strategy employed by the Marines revealed their understanding that defeating Whitebeard required more than simple, overwhelming force. They needed to exploit the weaknesses that age and illness had created while minimizing their exposure to the devastating attacks that he could still unleash when properly motivated. The placement of their forces, the timing of their counterattacks, and the deployment of their most powerful weapons all reflected careful study of intelligence reports about his condition and tactical assessments of how his declining health might affect his combat effectiveness. Yet even diminished by disease and age, Whitebeard dominated the battlefield with a presence that transcended mere physical power. His tactical decisions and strategic positioning demonstrating the accumulated wisdom of decades spent in conflicts that had shaped the modern world. Every move he made was calculated not just for immediate effect, but for its impact on the broader objectives of the rescue mission. His understanding of warfare going far beyond simple application of his devil fruit abilities to encompass psychological manipulation and strategic positioning. The Marines' systematic efforts to wear him down through attrition became increasingly effective as the battle progressed, his body's inability to recover from damage as quickly as it once had becoming more apparent with each exchange of attacks. The medical equipment that had become a constant presence in his daily life was obviously absent from the battlefield, leaving him dependent entirely upon his natural resilience and the protective efforts of his crew to sustain him through conflicts that would have challenged him even in his prime. The moment when Squad's blade pierced his chest marked not just a tactical setback, but the physical manifestation of the betrayal that had been orchestrated through careful manipulation of intelligence and emotions. The world government's psychological warfare proving as effective as their military preparations. The wound itself was serious but not immediately fatal, yet its symbolic impact was devastating. Proof that even the world's strongest man could bleed, could be deceived, could be hurt by those he trusted most completely. Whitebeard's response to this betrayal revealed the depths of his understanding of human nature and the complex motivations that drove men to make choices they would later regret. His forgiveness of Squad, stemming not from weakness, but from recognition that good people could be manipulated into serving evil purposes when their emotions were properly exploited. The embrace he offered his subordinate carried more healing power than any medical treatment, transforming a moment of devastating betrayal into an opportunity for redemption and renewed loyalty. The escalation of the battle that followed Squad's attack saw Whitebeard pushing his deteriorating body beyond every reasonable limit, his determination to save Ace overriding the increasingly urgent signals from failing organs and damaged systems that demanded rest and medical attention. Each technique he employed, each display of power he manifested, each strategic decision he implemented, drew upon reserves of strength that were not being replenished as quickly as they were being depleted. The Marines' recognition that their conventional tactics were insufficient to defeat him led to the deployment of weapons and strategies that had been held in reserve, secret projects and experimental technologies that represented the world government's most advanced military capabilities. The laser attacks, the specialized ammunition, the coordinated assaults by multiple admirals, all reflected their growing desperation to find some combination of force and tactics that could bring down an opponent whose resilience seemed to operate according to rules that transcended normal human limitations. Blackbeard's arrival on the battlefield transformed what had been a rescue mission into something approaching a family tragedy. The presence of the man who had betrayed Ace and orchestrated his capture, adding personal vengeance to the strategic objectives that had originally motivated Whitebeard's assault on Marineford. The confrontation between former captain and treacherous subordinate carried emotional weight that went far beyond their individual strength or tactical positioning. The battle between Whitebeard and Blackbeard was notable, not just for its intensity, but for the way it revealed the fundamental differences in their approaches to power and leadership. The world's strongest man's protective instincts contrasting sharply with his former subordinate's selfish ambitions. Blackbeard's cowardice in the face of Whitebeard's fury demonstrated that raw power, without courage or conviction, was insufficient when confronting someone whose entire existence had been dedicated to protecting others. The accumulation of wounds that Whitebeard sustained throughout the battle created a cascade of medical crises that would have killed lesser men long before they reached the point of being individually fatal, his body's systems beginning to shut down in sequence as blood loss, organ damage, and systemic trauma combined to create conditions that no amount of willpower could indefinitely overcome. Yet, still he fought on, driven by purposes that transcended personal survival or physical comfort. The 152 bullets that found their mark during the course of the battle were fired by Marines who understood that they were participating in something historic, each shot carefully aimed and deliberately placed in hopes of finding some vital spot that might finally bring down an opponent whose tolerance for damage seemed to operate according to supernatural principles. The 267 sword wounds that accumulated across his massive frame told the story of countless individual duels and skirmishes, each blade that found its mark, adding to a total that would have been instantly fatal to anyone whose reputation had not been built upon seeming invincibility. The 46 cannonballs that struck his body during the final phases of the battle were fired by artillery crews who had witnessed the ineffectiveness of their previous bombardments, yet continued their bombardment out of duty. Desperation, and the faint hope that sheer volume of explosives might accomplish what precision and strategy had failed to achieve. Each explosion added to the catastrophic damage that his body had already sustained, while somehow failing to accomplish the simple objective of making him fall. Ace's death, when it finally came, broke something fundamental in Whitebeard that all the Marines' weapons had failed to damage. The loss of the young man he had come to save striking at the very core of his identity as protector and father figure. The rage that consumed him in the aftermath of that loss was perhaps more terrifying than any display of power he had previously demonstrated. His devil fruit abilities, channeled through grief and fury, into attacks that reshaped the very geography of Marineford. The final confrontation with Blackbeard was conducted while Whitebeard's body was already shutting down, his organs failing in sequence as blood loss and trauma finally overwhelmed even his legendary constitution. Yet his attacks retained enough power to leave permanent scars on his opponent. Proof that even dying, even reduced to a fraction of his former strength, the world's strongest man remained dangerous enough to inspire fear in those who had thought his defeat was assured. The moment of Whitebeard's death was marked not by collapse or surrender, but by his refusal to fall backward even as life left his body, his final act of defiance, ensuring that history would record him as someone who had never retreated from any fight, regardless of the odds or consequences. The symbolic power of this image, a giant among men standing upright in death, would inspire stories and legends that would outlive the memory of the specific battles and conflicts that had brought him to this final moment. The declaration that accompanied his death, his confirmation that the One Piece was real and waiting to be claimed by someone worthy of Roger's legacy, ensured that his passing would mark not just the end of his individual story, but the beginning of new chapters in the larger saga of piracy and adventure that had defined the current era. His final words carried the weight of absolute authority, the testimony of someone who had possessed the strength to reach Laugh-Tale but had chosen different priorities. The silence that followed Whitebeard's death lasted only moments before being shattered by the recognition that an era had ended, that the world's strongest man had passed from legend into history, that the careful balance of power that had kept the world stable for decades had just been permanently altered. The Marines who had fought him, the pirates who had served under him, and the observers who had witnessed his final battle all understood that they had seen something unprecedented and unrepeatable. The investigation of his body in the aftermath of the battle revealed the full extent of the damage he had sustained while remaining upright and fighting, the medical impossibility of his continued functioning serving as final proof that some individuals operated according to principles that transcended ordinary human limitations. The scars that covered his frame told the story of a lifetime spent in battle, but notably, none were found upon his back, physical proof that he had never fled from any confrontation. Whitebeard's death marked the beginning of what would be remembered as the worst period of pirate expansion and conflict in modern history, his absence creating opportunities for ambitious individuals and organizations that had been held in check by fear of his retaliation. The territories he had protected fell into chaos. The crews he had sponsored found themselves without their most powerful patron, and the delicate arrangements that had maintained relative peace in large sections of the New World collapsed almost immediately. Yet his legacy lived on not just in the chaos that followed his passing, but in the example he had provided of what it meant to use overwhelming power in service of protection rather than conquest, to build a reputation based on loyalty rather than fear, and to face death with the same courage that had characterized his approach to life. The world's strongest man had proven that strength without compassion was meaningless, that power without purpose was ultimately hollow, and that even legends were mortal, while the ideals they embodied could achieve immortality. The funeral that his crew eventually held for him was attended by pirates and Marines alike, former enemies united in recognition that they had witnessed the end of something that would never be seen again in their lifetimes, or perhaps ever again in the history of human civilization. Whitebeard had been the last of his kind, a giant among giants whose passing left a void that no amount of ambition or strength could adequately fill. The burden of bearing the blood of the Pirate King was something that Port-Ghasty Ace carried not as a badge of honor, but as a curse that had shaped every moment of his existence since the day he learned the truth about his parentage. The knowledge that his very birth had been considered an abomination by the world government, that his mother had died to bring him into a world that would never accept his right to exist, created within him a complex relationship with life itself that oscillated between desperate desire for validation and equally desperate wish that he had never been born at all. The early years of Ace's life had been marked by the careful protection of those who understood what his bloodline meant and what dangers it would attract if discovered. Yet, even their love could not shield him from the gradual realization that he was fundamentally different from other children in ways that went far beyond simple family circumstances. The whispered conversations that stopped when he entered rooms, the careful way adults measured their words around him, the subtle but persistent sense that his very existence was somehow problematic. All of these factors combined to create an awareness that his life carried implications he was too young to understand but old enough to fear. Garp's training, brutal though it was, had provided Ace with both the strength necessary to survive in a world that would inevitably test him and the emotional framework needed to channel his inherited rage into something approaching constructive purpose. The old Marine's complex relationship with his own duties and loyalties created a unique environment where Ace could develop his abilities while learning that the simple categories of Marine and pirate, hero and villain, justice and criminality were far more complicated than most people preferred to believe. The brotherhood that formed between Ace, Sabo, and Luffy on Mount Corvo represented the first time in his life that Ace had experienced unconditional acceptance from peers who knew nothing of his heritage and cared nothing for the political implications of his existence. In their eyes, he was simply Ace, not the son of Roger, not a living symbol of everything the world government feared, but a friend whose value was determined by his character rather than his bloodline. This relationship became the foundation upon which he built his understanding of what family could mean when it was chosen, rather than imposed by biology or circumstance. The loss of Sabo had created the first major crack in Ace's emotional armor, the recognition that even the strongest bonds could be severed by forces beyond his control, that love and loyalty were no guarantee against the casual cruelty of a world that valued political stability over individual lives. The grief that consumed him in the aftermath of his brother's apparent death carried with it the bitter understanding that his own existence had contributed to the tragedy, that the world government's hunt for Roger's bloodline had created the circumstances that led to Sabo's desperate attempt to escape Goa Kingdom. The decision to become a pirate was motivated not by romantic dreams of adventure or desire for treasure, but by the practical recognition that his heritage made peaceful coexistence with the established order impossible, regardless of his personal preferences or behavior. If the world insisted on seeing him as a criminal because of his father's identity, then he would embrace that identity and use it to forge a path that honored his own values, rather than trying futilely to earn acceptance from those who had predetermined his unworthiness. The formation of the Spade Pirates represented Ace's first attempt to create something positive from the negative circumstances of his birth, gathering around himself individuals who chose to follow him based on their assessment of his character rather than fear of his reputation. The crew that emerged reflected his leadership style, fiercely loyal, protective of the innocent, and dedicated to proving that strength could serve purposes beyond simple domination or self-aggrandizement. The encounter with Whitebeard that led to Ace's eventual recruitment into the most powerful pirate crew in the New World began as a challenge driven by his need to prove himself against the strongest opponents available, but evolved into something far more profound when he discovered in Edward Newgate the father figure he had never known he was seeking. Whitebeard's ability to see past Ace's heritage to the person he was becoming provided validation that went beyond simple acceptance to encompass genuine appreciation for his unique qualities and potential. The years spent as a member of the Whitebeard Pirates allowed Ace to experience for the first time what it meant to be part of a functional family structure, where his value was never questioned and his contributions were appreciated without reference to his infamous parentage. The protection that Whitebeard's reputation provided extended not just to physical safety, but to psychological security. The knowledge that he had found a place where he belonged, and people who would defend his right to exist regardless of what the rest of the world might think. The development of his devil fruit powers during this period reflected his growing confidence and self-acceptance, the Mera Mera no Mi's fire abilities serving as perfect metaphor for the passionate nature that had always defined his character. The control he learned to exercise over these flames paralleled his growing mastery over the anger and self-doubt that had previously threatened to consume him, transformation of destructive emotions into protective power that could serve others rather than simply destroying enemies. The mission that led to his eventual capture was motivated by the same protective instincts that had always driven his most important decisions, his pursuit of Blackbeard representing not personal vendetta, but fulfillment of his responsibilities as a division commander charged with maintaining the safety and honor of his crew. The decision to follow Marshal D. Teach despite orders to let him go reflected Ace's understanding that some betrayals were too significant to ignore, that some threats had to be confronted regardless of the personal risks involved. The battle with Blackbeard on Bonaro Island demonstrated both the growth in Ace's abilities since joining Whitebeard's crew and the limitations that even dedicated training could not overcome when facing opponents whose powers operated according to entirely different principles. The Yami Yami, Nomi's ability to nullify other Devil Fruit abilities, created tactical challenges that Ace had never encountered, forcing him to rely on physical combat skills that, while considerable, were insufficient to overcome his opponent's advantages. The capture that followed his defeat marked the beginning of the most psychologically devastating period of Ace's life. The transition from valued family member and respected division commander to prize exhibit in the world government's demonstration of their power over even the most legendary bloodlines. The imprisonment at Impel Down was designed not just to contain him but to break his spirit, to reduce him from defiant symbol of inherited rebellion to broken example of what happened to those who challenged established authority. The announcement of his public execution transformed his personal tragedy into global spectacle. The world government's decision to make his death a public event, reflecting their understanding that his symbolic value as Roger's son was even greater than his individual threat as a powerful pirate. The execution platform that was constructed for this purpose was designed not just to kill him, but to demonstrate the futility of resistance against forces that had the power to erase even the most legendary legacies. The revelation of his parentage during the pre-execution broadcast was calculated to maximize the psychological impact of his death. The confirmation that the son of the Pirate King was about to be executed, serving multiple purposes for a government that understood the power of symbols and the importance of narrative control. Yet this same revelation also served to inspire those who saw in Ace's defiance proof that some spirits could not be broken regardless of the pressures brought to bear against them. Whitebeard's decision to launch a rescue mission represented validation that went beyond anything Ace had ever dared to hope for. The recognition that someone valued his life enough to risk everything in an attempt to save him. The knowledge that his adoptive father was willing to challenge the entire world government rather than accept his execution provided emotional sustenance during the darkest moments of his imprisonment, proof that his existence had meaning beyond the political implications of his bloodline. The Battle of Marineford that erupted around his rescue created a situation where Ace found himself simultaneously the most important person on the battlefield and completely powerless to influence its outcome. His imprisonment, reducing him to spectator status in a conflict that would determine not just his fate, but the future balance of power in the world. The sight of his family and friends risking their lives for his sake created a complex mixture of gratitude and guilt that would influence his actions during the crucial moments that followed his liberation. The successful removal of his sea stone handcuffs should have marked the beginning of his escape and return to safety, yet the psychological impact of witnessing the sacrifices being made for his sake had created within him an emotional volatility that made rational decision-making increasingly difficult. The deaths of subordinates who had followed Whitebeard into battle for his sake, the sight of his adoptive father sustaining injuries that were clearly life-threatening, the recognition that his capture had precipitated a war that was claiming hundreds of lives. All of these factors combined to create a state of mind where clear thinking became nearly impossible. Akainu's provocation was precisely calibrated to exploit the character flaws that Ace had spent years trying to overcome. The Admiral's insults to Whitebeard's honor and legacy striking at the core of everything that Ace valued most deeply. The suggestion that his adoptive father was a failure, that the man who had given him family and purpose was somehow inadequate compared to his biological father, triggered responses that were more emotional than rational, more protective than strategic. The decision to turn back and confront Akainu despite the desperate circumstances of their escape reflected not stupidity or thoughtless bravado, but the inevitable result of a lifetime spent struggling with questions of worth and belonging. Ace's need to defend Whitebeard's honor was so fundamental to his identity that ignoring the insult felt like betraying everything that had given his life meaning, like proving that he was indeed unworthy of the love and protection he had received from his adoptive family. The brief exchange of attacks between Ace and Akainu demonstrated that even in his emotional state, the young pirate retained formidable combat abilities that could challenge even an admiral under normal circumstances. The fire techniques he had perfected during his years with the Whitebeard pirates created spectacular displays of power that briefly gave hope to those who witnessed them that he might indeed be capable of defeating his opponent and completing their escape. The moment when Luffy found himself in the path of Akainu's attack transformed the battle from personal confrontation to family crisis. Ace's recognition that his younger brother faced imminent death, creating a situation where all other considerations became irrelevant. The speed with which he positioned himself between Luffy and the incoming Magma Fist reflected reflexes honed by years of training, but more importantly, it demonstrated the absolute priority he placed on his brother's safety over his own survival. The Magma Fist that pierced Ace's chest was not just a physical attack, but the culmination of everything that had made his life difficult from the moment of his birth. The world government's hatred for his bloodline finally finding its ultimate expression in the destruction of his body. The searing heat that consumed his internal organs was perhaps less painful than the recognition that his death would cause suffering to those who loved him, that his failure to escape would leave wounds in his family that might never properly heal. The final conversation between Ace and Luffy took place in a bubble of intimacy that seemed isolated from the chaos of the battlefield surrounding them, their exchange of words carrying weight that transcended the immediate circumstances of injury and approaching death. Ace's expressions of gratitude for the love he had received throughout his life represented the resolution of questions that had tormented him since childhood, the final acceptance that his existence had been valuable, regardless of the circumstances of his birth or the political implications of his heritage. The tears that Luffy shed as his brother died in his arms were perhaps the purest expression of grief ever witnessed on a battlefield, the sound of someone discovering that love could make loss infinitely more painful, while simultaneously making life infinitely more meaningful. The sight of the future Pirate King reduced to inconsolable sobbing created a moment of human vulnerability that transcended the strategic and political implications of the battle raging around them. Ace's death served as catalyst for changes that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation at Marineford, his sacrifice inspiring both his allies and enemies to reassess their understanding of what was truly valuable in life. The Marines who witnessed his final moments found themselves confronting the reality that their enemies were capable of the same love and loyalty that they claimed to defend, while the pirates who had fought to save him discovered new depths of commitment to the ideals he had embodied. The symbolic impact of his death resonated across the world in ways that the world government had not anticipated. His refusal to renounce his adoptive father, even when faced with torture and execution, serving as powerful testimony to the strength of chosen family bonds. The story of his sacrifice would inspire others who struggled with questions of identity and belonging, proving that worth was determined by actions and relationships rather than circumstances of birth. The grief that consumed Whitebeard in the aftermath of Ace's death transformed the world's strongest man from strategic leader into force of pure vengeance, his attacks on those responsible for his son's murder, demonstrating the dangerous unpredictability that could result when protective instincts were pushed beyond rational limits. The devastation he unleashed in his final battle was powered not just by his devil fruit abilities, but by the fury of someone who had failed in the most fundamental duty of parenthood. Ace's final impact on the world extended beyond the immediate consequences of his death to encompass the example he had provided of how individuals could transcend the limitations imposed by their heritage and circumstances. His life had proven that identity was something to be chosen rather than simply accepted, that family was defined by loyalty and love rather than biology, and that even those born under the darkest circumstances could become sources of light for others. The legacy he left behind was not measured in territories conquered or enemies defeated, but in the relationships he had forged and the principles he had embodied, the demonstration that strength could serve love rather than the reverse. His death marked not the end of his influence, but its transformation from direct action to inspirational memory, the kind of sacrifice that would continue to motivate others long after the specific circumstances that led to it had been forgotten by history. In the quiet moments when those who loved him would remember his life, rather than dwelling on the manner of his death, they would recall not the political implications of his bloodline, but the warmth of his smile, the fierce loyalty he had shown to his family, and the courage he had displayed in choosing to live authentically, despite every pressure to become something else. Portgas D. Ace had died as he had lived, protecting those he loved, and refusing to compromise his principles, regardless of the cost such refusal might demand. The man who would become known as Corazon carried within his heart a contradiction that defined every moment of his adult life, the impossible balance between genuine love for a brother whose path had led him into darkness and unwavering commitment to ideals of justice that demanded he work toward that same brother's destruction. Don Quixote Rocinante had chosen his loyalties with full understanding of what they would cost him, accepting a role that required him to live as a lie while serving what he believed to be a greater truth, knowing that discovery would mean not just death but the kind of betrayal that would poison his brother's heart against everything good that remained in the world. The decision to become an undercover marine agent within Doflamingo's crew had been born not from ambition or desire for adventure, but from the recognition that someone needed to monitor the activities of a man whose childhood trauma had twisted into something capable of threatening entire nations. Rocinante understood better than anyone the forces that had shaped his brother's worldview, the systematic destruction of their family's privileged existence that had left deep scars in a child's psyche, scars that had festered into a philosophy that viewed compassion as weakness and cruelty as strength. The years spent maintaining his cover as the mute second in command of the Don Quixote pirates were perhaps the most psychologically challenging of Rocinante's life, requiring him to witness atrocities that violated every principle he held dear while maintaining the facade of enthusiastic participation. The silence that he maintained through his devil fruit powers served multiple purposes. It protected his identity as a marine spy, while symbolically representing his inability to speak out against injustices he was powerless to prevent without destroying his effectiveness as an intelligence gatherer. The clumsiness that had characterized Rocinante since childhood became both genuine liability and useful misdirection in his undercover role, his tendency toward accidents and mishaps, creating a persona that was simultaneously endearing and unthreatening to those who might otherwise have questioned his presence within a crew known for its ruthless efficiency. His apparent incompetence served as perfect camouflage for activities that required considerable skill and intelligence, allowing him to gather information and report to his marine handlers without arousing suspicion among pirates who saw him as little more than comic relief. The internal struggle between his love for Doflamingo and his duty as a marine agent created a constant tension that manifested in ways both subtle and profound, his genuine affection for the brother he remembered from childhood conflicting with his growing understanding of the monster that brother had become. Each report he filed with Sengoku represented a betrayal of family bonds that had once been sacred, yet each act of violence he witnessed reinforced his conviction that his brother's activities could not be allowed to continue unchecked. The arrival of Trafalgar Law in Doflamingo's organization created a new dynamic that would ultimately define the final chapter of Rocinante's life. The presence of a child whose circumstances so closely paralleled his own childhood experiences, awakening protective instincts that had been dormant since his decision to dedicate his life to serving abstract concepts of justice rather than protecting specific individuals. Law's obvious intelligence and equally obvious pain struck something fundamental in Rocinante's character, the recognition of a soul that still possessed the capacity for goodness despite exposure to influences that might easily corrupt it. The discovery of Law's terminal illness transformed what might have been simple sympathy into desperate urgency. The knowledge that this brilliant child faced death through no fault of his own, creating a situation where Rocinante's abstract commitment to justice became focused on the concrete goal of saving a single life. The Amber Lead syndrome that poisoned Law's body was not just a medical condition, but a symptom of the larger corruptions that plagued their world. Governments that prioritized political stability over public health, institutions that sacrificed innocent lives to maintain convenient fictions about safety and security. The decision to take Law away from Doflamingo's influence, even temporarily, represented the first time since beginning his undercover mission that Rocinante had allowed personal considerations to override his professional responsibilities. The risk involved in leaving his position within the crew was enormous. Yet the alternative, watching a child die from a treatable condition while maintaining his cover, was simply unacceptable to someone whose sense of justice had always been grounded in protection of the innocent rather than abstract adherence to institutional priorities. The journey across the Grand Line in search of medical treatment for Law became a pilgrimage of hope and desperation. Rocinante's growing desperation at each failed consultation revealing the depths of his commitment to saving a child he had come to love as if he were his own son. Each doctor who turned them away, each medical facility that refused to treat Law's condition, each expert who declared the case hopeless, added weight to Rocinante's growing conviction that conventional medicine would prove insufficient to accomplish what needed to be done. The hospitals they visited represented cross-section of the Grand Line's medical establishment, from prestigious institutions that served wealthy clientele to charitable organizations that existed specifically to treat conditions that mainstream medicine had abandoned as hopeless. Yet, regardless of their reputation or specialization, each facility reached the same conclusion. Law's condition had progressed beyond the point where traditional treatments could provide anything more than temporary comfort, while the disease ran its inevitable course toward death. The psychological toll of watching Law's condition deteriorate while maintaining hope for his recovery created stress that manifested in ways Rocinante had never experienced during his years of undercover work, the abstract dangers of his spy activities seeming trivial compared to the concrete reality of a child's approaching death. The forced cheerfulness he maintained around Law, the optimistic predictions he made about their next consultation, the promises he offered about treatments that might yet prove effective. All of these represented acts of love, disguised as deception, lies told in service of hope, rather than personal advantage. The discovery that the Opope no Mi possessed healing properties that might cure Law's condition represented the first genuine hope they had encountered since beginning their medical odyssey, yet the circumstances surrounding the fruit's availability created moral complications that would define the remainder of Rocinante's life. The knowledge that his brother coveted the same fruit for entirely different reasons transformed what should have been straightforward acquisition into elaborate deception that would require him to betray not just his cover, but potentially his entire mission as a marine agent. Doflamingo's interest in the Opope no Mi was motivated not by compassion for sick children, but by the fruit's legendary ability to grant immortality to another person at the cost of the user's life, the ultimate technique that would allow him to achieve the eternal existence necessary for his grandiose plans of world domination. The irony that the same devil fruit could serve either healing or conquest was not lost on Rocinante, who understood that his success in obtaining it for Law would simultaneously deny his brother a tool that could make him nearly unstoppable. The heist that Rocinante planned to steal the devil fruit from Doflamingo's operations required him to utilize skills that went far beyond his apparent competence, the same intelligence and tactical thinking that had made him valuable to the Marines now deployed in service of saving a single child's life. The complexity of coordinating his movements to avoid detection by his own crew members, while ensuring Law remained safe, created challenges that were simultaneously operational and emotional, each step of the plan carrying risks that could result in discovery and execution. The moment when Law consumed the Opope no Mi represented triumph that was immediately overshadowed by the recognition of what discovery of their actions would mean. The knowledge that Doflamingo's rage at being deceived would be focused not just on the theft itself, but on the identity of the thief. Rocinante understood that his brother's capacity for cruelty was virtually unlimited when applied to those who had betrayed his trust. Yet the sight of Law's immediate improvement made any personal consequences seem worthwhile. The discovery of Rocinante's true identity as a Marine spy came not through careful investigation, but through the kind of casual observation that made long-term undercover work so dangerous. His brother's sharp intelligence finally focusing on inconsistencies that had been accumulating for years. Doflamingo's realization that he had been harboring an enemy within his inner circle created a rage that went beyond simple anger at deception to encompass the personal pain of family betrayal. The recognition that someone he had loved and trusted had been systematically working toward his destruction. The confrontation that followed was conducted with the kind of cold fury that was perhaps more frightening than explosive anger. Doflamingo's questions delivered with surgical precision, designed to extract maximum psychological pain while confirming the extent of his brother's betrayal. Each answer that Rocinante provided revealed new layers of deception. Years of false loyalty peeled away to expose the Marine agent who had been gathering intelligence while pretending to serve pirate interests. The torture that preceded Rocinante's execution was motivated less by desire for information than by need for revenge. Doflamingo's systematic infliction of pain serving as expression of the hurt he felt at discovering that his trust had been misplaced for so many years. Yet even under duress that would have broken most men, Rocinante maintained his primary focus on Law's safety, using his devil fruit powers to ensure that the child remained hidden and silent, even as his own body was destroyed by his brother's methodical cruelty. The final application of his Nagi Nagi no Mi abilities represented perhaps the most heroic use of a devil fruit power in recorded history. Rocinante's creation of a soundproof barrier around Law's hiding place, ensuring that not even involuntary sounds would betray the child's presence to those who sought his death. The technique required him to maintain concentration even as bullets tore through his body, to hold the barrier in place even as his life ebbed away, to prioritize Law's safety over his own comfort during his final moments. The smile that Rocinante wore as he died was not grimace of pain or expression of madness, but genuine happiness born from the knowledge that his sacrifice had served its intended purpose, that the child he had come to love would survive to use his new abilities in service of whatever purposes his own choices would determine. The sight of that smile, visible to Law, even through the horror of watching his savior's execution, would become a touchstone that would influence every major decision the young man would make throughout his subsequent career as a pirate and eventual ally to those who opposed his former captain's ambitions. Doflamingo's immediate regret at killing his brother manifested not as grief but as rage at circumstances that had forced him to destroy someone he had genuinely loved. His inability to process complex emotions, leading him to redirect blame toward Law and anyone else who had played roles in creating the situation that had led to this tragic conclusion. The psychological damage inflicted by having to execute his own brother would influence his behavior for years to come, adding new layers of cruelty and unpredictability to someone who had already been dangerous enough when motivated purely by ambition and ideology. The legacy of Rocinante's sacrifice lived on not just in Law's survival, but in the example it provided of how love could motivate individuals to transcend the limitations of their circumstances and loyalties, how genuine compassion could inspire acts of courage that seemed impossible when viewed from perspectives focused on self-preservation. His death proved that some bonds were stronger than ideology, that some duties were more important than personal safety, and that the lives of innocents were worth defending, regardless of the cost such defense might demand. Law's subsequent development into someone capable of strategic thinking and long-term planning reflected not just his natural intelligence but the influence of Rocinante's example, the demonstration that adults could be trusted to sacrifice themselves for children's welfare, creating psychological foundation that would allow him to form meaningful relationships despite the trauma he had experienced. The medical knowledge he would eventually acquire and apply in service of healing others represented direct continuation of Rocinante's mission, the skills that had been preserved through sacrifice now deployed in service of preserving other lives. The room that Law would create with his devil fruit powers served as living monument to Rocinante's memory, the blue dome that provided sanctuary and healing carrying within its structure the same protective impulses that had motivated the Marine spy's final actions. Each person who found safety within those barriers benefited not just from Law's medical expertise, but from the love that had been passed down from someone who had understood that true strength lay in willingness to suffer for others, rather than forcing others to suffer for oneself. The years that would pass before Law felt ready to take direct action against Doflamingo represented not cowardice, but careful preparation, motivated by understanding that revenge, when it finally came, needed to honor Rocinante's sacrifice by serving larger purposes than simple personal satisfaction. The alliance he would eventually forge with Monkey D. Luffy reflected lessons learned from someone who had proven that the most effective opposition to tyranny came not from matching cruelty with cruelty, but from demonstrating that different approaches were possible. Corazon's death had proven that even in a world dominated by violence and betrayal, individuals could choose to embody different values, could sacrifice themselves in service of protecting rather than destroying, could use their final moments to create rather than eliminate possibilities. His smile in death became symbol, not of defeat, but of victory over forces that sought to convince people that compassion was weakness, that love was liability, and that the innocent deserved whatever fate their circumstances imposed upon them. The Marine who had lived as a lie in service of truth had died as himself in service of love, his final act of authenticity ensuring that his legacy would inspire rather than embitter those who remembered him, that his sacrifice would multiply rather than simply end with his death, and that the child he had saved would carry forward the best aspects of his character while avoiding the tragic circumstances that had made such sacrifice necessary. The return to Wano country should have been a moment of triumph for Kazuki Oden, the legendary samurai whose adventures with the Roger pirates had made him perhaps the most celebrated figure in his homeland's history. Yet what he discovered upon setting foot on familiar shores filled him with a horror that cut deeper than any blade he had ever faced in battle. The country that had nurtured his dreams of opening its borders to the wider world had been transformed into something unrecognizable, its people reduced to shadows of their former selves, its natural beauty scarred by industrial pollution that served the interests of foreign occupiers rather than native inhabitants. The Wano that existed in Oden's memories was a land of pristine rivers where crystal clear water supported abundant life, of forests where ancient trees provided shelter for creatures that existed nowhere else in the world, of villages where traditional crafts had been passed down through generations of artisans whose skills represented the accumulated wisdom of centuries. The reality that greeted his return was a nightmare of poisoned waterways, clear-cut hillsides, and communities where despair had replaced the quiet pride that had once characterized his people's relationship with their homeland. Kurozumi Orochi's rise to power had been facilitated not through legitimate succession or popular support, but through a combination of deception, manipulation, and alliance with forces that viewed Wano not as a sovereign nation, but as a resource to be exploited. The puppet shogun's collaboration with Kaido represented more than simple political expedience. It was the complete betrayal of everything that the position of shogun was meant to represent, the transformation of a role dedicated to protecting the people into an instrument for their systematic oppression. The industrial facilities that had been constructed throughout the country served not to improve the lives of Wano's citizens, but to support Kaido's military ambitions, their massive smokestacks pouring toxins into air that had once been clean enough to sustain the delicate ecosystem that made the island unique among all the territories of the New World. The weapons factories, the mining operations, the chemical processing plants, all of these represented the systematic destruction of Wano's natural heritage in service of goals that had nothing to do with the welfare of its people. Oden's initial response to these discoveries was characteristic of his direct nature, the immediate impulse to challenge Orochi and his beast pirates' allies through straightforward combat that would resolve the crisis through superior strength applied decisively. His confidence in his own abilities was not mere arrogance, but realistic assessment based on years of experience fighting alongside the strongest individuals in the world. Encounters that had proven his capacity to stand against opponents whose power had become legendary throughout the Grand Line. The strategic patience that Oden ultimately displayed in the face of such overwhelming provocation represented perhaps the greatest test of his character, the suppression of every heroic instinct he possessed, in favor of a plan that promised to minimize casualties among the innocent, while maximizing the chances of permanent liberation. The 5-year agreement he entered into with Orochi was not capitulation, but calculated sacrifice, the trading of his own honor and reputation for time that could be used to prepare for a confrontation that would determine Wano's future for generations. The dancing that Oden performed weekly in the streets of the Flower Capital was designed by his enemies to humiliate him in the eyes of his own people, to transform the legendary samurai into an object of mockery whose reduced circumstances would serve as warning to anyone who might consider opposing the new order. Each performance was crafted to strip away layers of dignity and respect that had been built over decades of heroic service, to reduce him from symbol of resistance to pathetic figure whose desperation made him willing to debase himself for minor considerations. Yet, those who witnessed these performances with understanding eyes recognized them not as evidence of defeat, but as demonstrations of love so profound that it was willing to endure any indignity in service of protecting others. The man who had sailed with Roger and Whitebeard, who had faced down sea kings and marines and pirates without ever showing fear, was subjecting himself to public ridicule because he believed such sacrifice would spare his people greater suffering during the preparation period needed for effective resistance. The reaction of Wano's citizens to Odin's weekly humiliation revealed the complex ways that hope and despair could coexist within populations living under oppressive conditions, some interpreting his behavior as evidence that even legendary heroes could be broken by sufficient pressure, while others recognized the nobility inherent in his willingness to bear personal shame for their collective benefit. The whispered conversations that took place in private homes and secret gatherings showed that understanding of his true motivations was not universal, but existed among those who had maintained faith in the possibility of eventual liberation. The strain that this period of apparent submission placed upon Odin's family and closest supporters was perhaps more difficult for him to endure than the public mockery. His wife and children forced to witness his degradation while maintaining the pretense that his actions served purposes they could not openly discuss. Kozuki Toki's support during this period demonstrated strength that matched her husband's. Her use of time-related abilities to gather intelligence and coordinate resistance activities representing contribution that was crucial, but necessarily invisible, to those who might report such activities to their oppressors. The Kozuki retainers who had served Odin since childhood found themselves torn between loyalty to their lord and inability to comprehend strategies that seemed to contradict everything they had been taught about honor and duty, their confusion reflecting the broader difficulty that principled people faced when required to navigate circumstances where traditional codes of conduct proved inadequate. The discipline they showed in following orders that violated their instincts demonstrated trust in Odin's judgment that transcended their understanding of his methods. The revelation that Orochi and Kaido had been systematically violating the terms of their agreement, even as Odin fulfilled his obligations with scrupulous precision, marked the end of any possibility for peaceful resolution and the probably beginning of preparations for the confrontation that had always been inevitable. The intelligence gathered during the years of apparent submission had revealed the full extent of the enemy's strength and the strategic positions they had established throughout the country, information that would prove crucial in planning effective resistance. The final decision to abandon patience in favor of direct action was precipitated not by personal frustration, but by evidence that continued delay would only strengthen their enemies, while weakening the possibility of successful liberation. The weapons smuggling, the expansion of industrial facilities, the importation of additional Beast Pirates personnel, all of these developments indicated that Kaido was using the period of peace to consolidate his position in ways that would make eventual resistance increasingly difficult. The march toward Onigashima, that represented Odin's final military campaign, was undertaken with full understanding that victory was far from certain, yet his decision to proceed reflected calculation that delay would only worsen their strategic position while potentially demoralizing supporters who had endured years of oppression while waiting for their promised salvation. The small force that accompanied him represented not the full strength of potential resistance, but the core of individuals whose commitment to liberation transcended considerations of personal safety. The battle for Onigashima demonstrated that even after years of apparent inactivity, Odin retained the devastating combat abilities that had made him legendary throughout the seas. His swordsmanship, creating opportunities for victory that seemed to justify his confidence in the possibility of defeating even overwhelmingly superior numbers through superior skill and determination. The techniques he employed drew upon everything he had learned during his travels, with the world's greatest pirates, adapted to serve the specific requirements of liberating his homeland from foreign occupation. The moment when victory seemed within reach, when Odin's blades were positioned to deliver the decisive blow against Kaido himself, represented the culmination of years of planning and sacrifice, the vindication of strategies that had required him to endure humiliation while maintaining faith in eventual triumph. The sight of the Emperor of the Sea vulnerable to his attack created hope that the nightmare of occupation was about to end, that Wano would soon be restored to the independence and prosperity that its people deserved. The intervention that prevented this victory from being achieved was as cruel as it was effective. The appearance of Kurozumi Higurashi disguised as his son, creating a moment of hesitation that allowed Kaido to recover and launch the counterattack that would prove decisive. The psychological manipulation involved in using his love for his family against him demonstrated the depths of cruelty that his enemies were willing to employ, the willingness to exploit the noblest emotions for the most ignoble purposes. The capture that followed his defeat marked not just military setback but the complete vindication of his enemy's strategy, their patient manipulation of his protective instincts having finally created the opening necessary to neutralize the greatest threat to their control over Wano. The chains that bound him were more than physical restraints. They represented the triumph of deception over honor, of cruelty over nobility, of those who would exploit love rather than embody it. The proposed execution by boiling was designed not merely to kill Odin, but to provide public spectacle that would demonstrate the futility of resistance while terrorizing any who might consider following his example. The method chosen specifically for its capacity to inflict maximum suffering, while allowing sufficient time for the condemned to contemplate the hopelessness of his situation. The crowd that gathered to witness this execution was meant to see not martyrdom but defeat, not inspiration but warning about the consequences of challenging established authority. Odin's counter-proposal to survive an hour in the boiling pot in exchange for his retainer's freedom represented both tactical calculation and moral imperative. His assessment that such a feat was theoretically possible, combining with his absolute commitment to protecting those who had served him loyally throughout their shared ordeals. The bargain he struck was designed to appeal to his captor's sadistic desire to see him suffer, while creating genuine possibility for his supporters' survival and eventual continuation of resistance activities. The hour that followed was perhaps the most extraordinary demonstration of human endurance ever recorded. Odin's ability to withstand temperatures that should have killed him within minutes, reflecting not just physical conditioning but spiritual strength that transcended normal human limitations. The wooden plank that supported his 9 retainers above his head became symbol of his protective nature, the literal weight of their bodies, representing the metaphorical burden of responsibility that he had carried throughout his adult life. The physical agony of standing in boiling oil was compounded by the psychological torture of knowing that any sign of weakness, any moment of failure, would result in the death of men who had trusted him with their lives and futures. Each second that passed required him to maintain not just physical strength but mental focus, to resist the natural human tendency to prioritize personal survival over abstract obligations to others. The crowd that witnessed this ordeal found themselves confronting something that challenged their understanding of what was possible. The sight of someone enduring conditions that should have been instantly fatal while maintaining enough composure to support the weight of 9 adult men above his head. The silence that gradually replaced initial jeering reflected their growing recognition that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a display of will that transcended their previous understanding of human capability. The stories that Odin told during that hour served multiple purposes. They distracted him from his physical agony while providing his retainers with final instructions and the assembled crowd with glimpse into the adventures that had shaped his worldview. Each tale was carefully chosen to convey specific lessons about courage, loyalty, and the importance of maintaining hope. Even when circumstances seemed hopeless, his words creating legacy that would survive, even if his body did not. The completion of the full hour represented triumph that his enemies had never expected him to achieve, the fulfillment of conditions that they had assumed were impossible, while maintaining the appearance of offering genuine opportunity for negotiation. Yet their decision to violate the agreement even after he had met their demands revealed the fundamental dishonesty that had characterized their entire approach to governance. The willingness to break any promise when doing so served their immediate interests. The final betrayal that came in the form of additional oil being added to the pot, raising the temperature beyond even his extraordinary tolerance, was accompanied by Orochi's explanation that he had never intended to honor their agreement, that the entire spectacle had been designed purely for entertainment rather than genuine negotiation. This revelation served to demonstrate not just personal cruelty, but institutional corruption, the complete absence of honor or principle in those who claimed authority over others. The gunshots that finally ended Odin's suffering came not as mercy, but as frustrated recognition that even death could not diminish the impact of what he had accomplished. His survival of the full hour, having created legend that would inspire resistance for generations to come. The bullets that pierced his body were aimed not just at ending his life, but at preventing him from continuing to speak words that might further inspire those who witnessed his execution. His final declaration about the dawn that would come to Wano carried prophetic weight that went beyond simple hope or wishful thinking. His understanding of historical patterns and human nature providing him with confidence that oppression, no matter how complete it might seem, could never permanently suppress the desire for freedom that lived within every human heart. The 20 years he predicted would be required for liberation would prove remarkably accurate, suggesting that his assessment was based not on mere optimism, but on realistic understanding of the time needed for proper preparation. The death of Kozuki Oden marked not the end of resistance in Wano, but its transformation from direct confrontation to patient preparation. His sacrifice, providing the inspiration necessary to sustain hope through 2 decades of continued oppression, while his retainers worked to fulfill the promises he had made with his final breath. The legend that grew around his final hour would prove more powerful than any military force, creating foundation upon which eventual liberation would be built. The example he had provided of love strong enough to endure any suffering, of leadership that prioritized protection over personal comfort, of honor that remained intact even when faced with the most degrading circumstances, became template that would guide future generations in their own struggles against injustice and oppression. His death had proven that some things were indeed worth dying for, that sacrifice could achieve victories that survival alone could never accomplish, and that true strength was measured not by what one could destroy, but by what one was willing to endure to protect what mattered most. The chains that bound Fisher Tiger to the rocky outcropping of Mariehua were forged not merely from sea stone and steel, but from the accumulated cruelty of centuries, each link representing another soul who had been reduced to property, another life torn from family and freedom to serve the whims of those who claimed dominion over others, by virtue of nothing more substantial than the circumstances of their birth. The scars that covered his massive frame told stories that no official history would ever record, testimonies written in flesh about the systematic dehumanization that the world government had elevated to the status of divine right. The young fishman who had been captured during one of the routine slave raids that supplied Mariehua with its constant stream of forced labor had possessed the same fierce independence that would later make him a legend among his people, yet even his formidable strength had proven insufficient against the coordinated efforts of professional slavers whose techniques had been refined through generations of practice. The nets that had hauled him from familiar waters were woven not just from rope and metal, but from the accumulated expertise of those who had made careers from the business of buying and selling human dignity. The years that Fischer Tiger spent in bondage were marked not by gradual acceptance of his circumstances, but by the slow accumulation of rage that would eventually fuel his escape and subsequent career as liberator of others who had endured similar fates. Each day of captivity was a lesson in the depths of cruelty that civilized society was capable of inflicting when it convinced itself that certain categories of beings were not deserving of the basic consideration that defined moral behavior. Each night a meditation on the contrast between the freedom he had known and the degradation that had become his daily reality. The work that slaves were forced to perform in Marieha was designed not merely to accomplish necessary tasks, but to reinforce their psychological subjugation through systematic humiliation that left no doubt about their status as property rather than people. The construction projects, the maintenance duties, the personal services that supported the lifestyle of the world nobles. All of these were structured to emphasize the absolute power that masters exercised over every aspect of their chattel's existence, from the most basic biological needs to the most intimate expressions of identity and preference. The relationships that formed between slaves represented both sanctuary and additional vulnerability, bonds of solidarity and mutual support that provided psychological sustenance while creating new avenues through which their captors could inflict pain. Fischer Tiger witnessed countless examples of how love could be weaponized against those who possessed nothing else of value, families threatened, and friends tortured to ensure compliance from individuals who might otherwise have found ways to resist their circumstances. The planning that preceded Fischer Tiger's eventual escape required not just physical preparation, but psychological evolution, the transformation of someone who had been systematically conditioned to accept powerlessness into someone capable of conceiving and executing plans that challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which the entire system of slavery was based. The intelligence gathering, the identification of weaknesses in security arrangements, the cultivation of allies among fellow slaves. All of these activities represented acts of rebellion that could have resulted in punishments that made normal brutalities seem merciful by comparison. The actual escape itself was accomplished not through overwhelming force, but through careful exploitation of the complacency that had developed among guards who had come to view their charges as broken spirits, incapable of effective resistance. The systematic conditioning that reduced people to property, having apparently convinced even their captors that the transformation was complete and irreversible. The moment when Fischer Tiger's chains finally broke represented more than personal liberation. It was the shattering of assumptions about the permanence of oppression and the impossibility of meaningful resistance. The decision to free other slaves during his escape rather than simply securing his own freedom reflected the understanding that individual liberation was meaningless as long as the system that created slavery continued to operate, that true freedom required not just personal escape, but collective action that challenged the entire structure of institutionalized oppression. The fires that consumed sections of Mariéchois during that night were lit, not by random vandalism, but by careful calculation, the destruction targeting symbols and infrastructure that supported the slave trade while avoiding areas where innocent people might be harmed. The founding of the Sun Pirates represented Fisher Tiger's recognition that escape from slavery was only the first step in a longer journey toward genuine freedom, that former slaves needed not just liberation but protection, purpose, and the kind of community that could help them rebuild lives that had been systematically destroyed by their captivity. The crew that gathered around him consisted not just of fishmen, but of individuals from every species and background that had been victimized by the slave trade, their diversity serving as living proof that oppression was not limited by racial or cultural boundaries. The philosophy that guided the Sun Pirates' activities was grounded not in simple revenge against their former captors, but in commitment to preventing others from experiencing the suffering they had endured. Their attacks on slave ships and facilities representing proactive defense of the innocent rather than reactive violence against specific enemies. Each rescue they performed was simultaneously practical liberation of specific individuals and symbolic demonstration that the slave trade was not as invulnerable as its practitioners preferred to believe. The relationship that developed between Fisher Tiger and his crew members reflected his understanding that true leadership required not domination but inspiration, not the imposition of will, but the cultivation of shared purpose that allowed individuals to contribute their unique strengths to collective objectives. The respect he commanded was earned not through fear or manipulation, but through demonstration of principles that remained constant regardless of circumstances. Proof that someone who had been reduced to property could rise to become a protector of others. The rescue of Koala represented both typical Sun Pirates operation and unique challenge, the discovery of a human child among the slaves they liberated, creating complications that went beyond simple logistics to encompass fundamental questions about the possibility of reconciliation between species that had been trained to view each other as natural enemies. The little girl's obvious terror at finding herself among fishmen reflected conditioning that began in earliest childhood, systematic indoctrination that portrayed her rescuers as monsters whose kindness was probably deception designed to make her eventual fate more cruel. The patience that Fisher Tiger displayed in dealing with Koala's initial fear and hostility demonstrated growth in his own character, the evolution from someone whose experiences might have justified hatred toward all humans into someone capable of recognizing innocence and responding to it with appropriate compassion. The gradual transformation of her terror into trust served as proof that the cycles of hatred which seemed so permanent could indeed be broken when approached with sufficient wisdom and persistence. The months spent traveling toward Koala's home island provided Fisher Tiger with opportunity to observe the healing process that was possible when trauma was addressed with appropriate care and understanding, the child's gradual recovery serving as metaphor for the larger healing that might be possible between species if given proper conditions and sufficient time. Her laughter, when it finally emerged, represented victory over forces that had tried to poison her childhood with fear and hatred, proof that innocence could survive even the most systematic attempts to destroy it. The decision to personally deliver Koala to her family, rather than simply dropping her at the nearest port, reflected Fisher Tiger's understanding that incomplete liberation was often worse than continued captivity, that returning her to circumstances where she might face punishment or rejection for her association with pirates would constitute betrayal of the trust she had learned to place in him and his crew. The preparation for what would prove to be his final voyage was marked by discussions about the future of the Sun Pirates and the continuation of their mission, even if something happened to their captain. Conversations that revealed both Fisher Tiger's recognition that leadership positions were temporary and his commitment to ensuring that the principles they served would outlive any individual who embodied them. The arrangements he made for crew members who might not survive the journey, the distribution of responsibilities that would allow the organization to continue functioning without him, the establishment of relationships with other groups that shared their objectives. All of these represented attempts to institutionalize resistance in ways that did not depend upon his continued presence. The island where Koala's family lived appeared peaceful and welcoming from a distance, yet Fisher Tiger's experience had taught him to be suspicious of surface appearances, particularly in matters involving the treatment of former slaves and their associates. The intelligence gathering he conducted before making contact revealed undercurrents of fear and resentment that suggested their arrival would be viewed as disruption rather than homecoming, complications that required careful navigation to avoid creating additional trauma for the child they had worked so hard to heal. The reunion between Koala and her mother was everything that Fisher Tiger had hoped it would be. The joy and relief evident in their embrace, serving as validation for every risk the Sun Pirates had taken during their journey, every sacrifice they had made to ensure her safe return to people who loved her. The tears that flowed during that reunion were composed not just of happiness at restoration of family bonds, but of grief for time that had been lost and innocence that could never be fully recovered. The betrayal that followed so closely upon this moment of triumph was perhaps more painful than any physical wound Fisher Tiger had ever received. The revelation that Koala's family had contacted the Marines, creating a situation where his compassion had been transformed into trap, his desire to help converted into instrument of his own destruction. The knowledge that people he had helped were willing to sacrifice him to protect themselves challenged his fundamental beliefs about human nature and the possibility of redemption through good works. The ambush that resulted from this betrayal was carefully planned and efficiently executed. The Marines who surrounded Fisher Tiger and his companions, representing elite forces specifically trained for confronting dangerous pirates rather than routine law enforcement personnel who might have been overcome through superior combat skills, the weapons they carried, the tactics they employed, the coordination they displayed, all reflected careful study of Sun Pirates' operations and strategic assessment of what would be required to defeat opponents who had previously escaped from seemingly impossible situations. The battle that followed was marked not by Fisher Tiger's usual tactical brilliance, but by the desperate fury of someone who had been forced to confront the possibility that his life's work had been based upon false premises, that the compassion he had shown toward humans had been interpreted as weakness rather than strength. The wounds he inflicted upon his attackers were testimony to the fighting abilities that had made him legendary among pirates, yet they were also expressions of heartbreak that ran deeper than any physical injury. The escape that his crew managed to arrange came at enormous cost in terms of both casualties and resources. Their extraction of their wounded captain from Marine custody, representing triumph that felt more like defeat given the circumstances that had made such extraction necessary. The ship that carried them away from the island bore not just their physical forms, but the weight of disillusionment that would influence every subsequent decision Fisher Tiger made about his relationship with the human species. The medical treatment that Fisher Tiger required after sustaining such severe injuries pushed beyond every resource the Sun Pirates possessed, his wounds having been inflicted with weapons specifically designed to cause maximum damage to fishman physiology, rather than simple implements of conventional warfare. The blood loss that accompanied his injuries created a situation where immediate transfusion was necessary to prevent death. Yet the type of blood required for such transfusion was available only from sources that carried implications he found impossible to accept. The human blood that could have saved Fisher Tiger's life represented more than medical necessity. It was symbol of everything that had shaped his worldview, the forced intimacy with humanity that had defined his years in slavery, the biological dependency that would make his survival contingent upon accepting help from members of the species that had systematically dehumanized him. The decision he faced was not simply medical but philosophical. The choice between life and principles that had guided every major decision of his adult existence. The crew members who pleaded with him to accept the transfusion understood that they were asking him to violate beliefs that had sustained him through experiences that would have broken lesser spirits. Yet their love for their captain made them willing to challenge even his most deeply held convictions if doing so might preserve his life. The arguments they presented focused not on abstract principles but on concrete consequences. The people who still needed his protection, the missions that remained to be completed, the example his survival would provide to others who faced similar struggles. The refusal that Fisher Tiger ultimately gave was delivered not with anger or bitterness, but with the calm certainty of someone who had always understood that some prices were too high to pay, regardless of what they might purchase. That survival without integrity was not actually survival, but merely the continuation of biological processes in the absence of everything that made life meaningful. His explanation to his grieving crew members revealed depths of thought and feeling that went far beyond simple prejudice or stubborn adherence to abstract ideology. The death that followed was perhaps more peaceful than any other conclusion to Fisher Tiger's story could have been. His refusal to compromise his principles, even when faced with mortality, serving as final demonstration of the strength that had sustained him throughout his remarkable career as liberator and leader. The smile that played across his features as consciousness faded was not grimace of pain but expression of satisfaction at having lived authentically until the very end. The legacy that Fisher Tiger left behind was measured not in territories conquered or enemies defeated, but in lives transformed and principles established. Proof that individuals who refused to accept injustice could inspire changes that outlived their personal existence. The crew he had built, the philosophy he had articulated, the example he had provided, all of these continued to influence events long after his death, ensuring that his sacrifice would multiply rather than simply end with his passing. The impact of his refusal to accept human blood resonated throughout the Fishman community as demonstration that some forms of resistance were more important than survival itself, that maintaining dignity in death was preferable to accepting life on terms that violated everything one believed about right and wrong. His choice became template for others who faced similar dilemmas, proof that it was possible to remain true to one's convictions, even when doing so required the ultimate sacrifice. The transformation that his death inspired in those who had witnessed it created ripple effects that would continue to influence relations between species for generations to come. His example, serving as both inspiration and challenge to those who claimed to share his values while being unwilling to accept similar costs for maintaining them. Fisher Tiger had proven that freedom was not something that could be granted by others, but something that had to be claimed and defended by those who valued it more than life itself. The discovery of two small children washed ashore on the beaches of Kokoyasi village should have been a simple matter of contacting authorities and arranging proper care through established channels. Yet something in the sight of their bedraggled forms and hollow eyes spoke to Bellamir's heart with a clarity that transcended bureaucratic procedures and practical considerations. The former Marine who had survived battles that claimed the lives of countless comrades found herself confronting a different kind of warfare. The quiet struggle between self-preservation and the impulse to protect innocence had been abandoned by whatever circumstances had brought them to her doorstep. Bellamir's own childhood had been marked by the absence of the kind of unconditional love that every child deserved. Her path to military service, paved by the recognition that structure and purpose could substitute for the warmth of family bonds, when such bonds were unavailable through conventional means. The scars she carried from her service in the Marines were not just physical reminders of battles fought and survived, but psychological markers of someone who understood that protection of the innocent was not abstract duty but sacred, calling that gave meaning to existence in ways that personal ambitions or material success could never achieve. The decision to adopt Nami and Nojiko was made not through careful deliberation or detailed planning, but through the immediate recognition that these children needed what she could provide, that their survival and future happiness had become her responsibility in ways that transcended legal obligations or social expectations. The paperwork that formalized their relationship was merely bureaucratic acknowledgement of bonds that had been forged in the moment she first saw them, and understood that walking away would represent betrayal of everything she believed about duty and compassion. The early years of their life together were marked by the kind of struggles that characterized most single-parent households, where love was abundant but financial resources remained chronically insufficient. Yet somehow the small house they shared felt richer than the grandest mansions because it contained something that no amount of money could purchase: the security that came from knowing they were wanted and valued for who they were, rather than what they might contribute to someone else's objectives. Bellemere's approach to parenting reflected her military background in ways both beneficial and occasionally problematic. Her understanding of discipline and structure, providing framework for healthy development, while sometimes failing to account for the emotional needs of children who had experienced trauma before finding safety in her care. The lessons she taught about self-reliance and personal responsibility were balanced by demonstrations of unconditional support that showed her daughters they could depend upon her strength while developing their own capabilities. The financial pressures that accompanied raising two children on a former Marine's modest savings were compounded by Bellemere's refusal to compromise her principles in ways that might have provided easier access to resources, her integrity preventing her from pursuing opportunities that would have required her to abandon the values that had guided her throughout her military service. The work she found in Kokoyasu village was honest but poorly compensated, leaving the family in circumstances where every expense required careful consideration and many desires had to be deferred indefinitely. The tangerine grove that Bellemere cultivated with painstaking care represented both practical necessity and symbolic gesture, her efforts to coax fruit from difficult soil serving as metaphor for her approach to nurturing her daughters through circumstances that might easily have overwhelmed less determined individuals. Each tree she planted was investment in a future she might not live to see. Every hour spent tending the grove, an act of faith that patient effort would eventually produce results that justified the sacrifices required to sustain it. Nami's early fascination with cartography and navigation revealed aptitudes that Bellemere recognized as potentially valuable, but also dangerous in a world where such skills could attract attention from those who viewed talented individuals as resources to be exploited rather than people to be protected. The encouragement she provided for her daughter's intellectual development was carefully balanced against warnings about the risks that came with exceptional abilities in fields that interested pirates and other predators. Nojiko's more grounded temperament and practical skills made her natural helper in the daily tasks that kept their household functioning, yet Bellemere was careful to ensure that her older daughter's sense of responsibility did not become burden that prevented her from pursuing her own dreams and interests. The balance between utilizing her willingness to help and protecting her right to childhood required constant adjustment as circumstances evolved and new challenges emerged. The community that surrounded their small family provided support network that made survival possible despite their limited resources. Neighbors who understood that helping Bellemere meant investing in the welfare of children who had already endured more hardship than most adults would face in entire lifetimes. The informal arrangements for sharing resources, providing childcare, and offering assistance during difficult periods created safety net that allowed them to weather crises that might otherwise have destroyed their fragile stability. The stories that Belamir told her daughters about her military service were carefully edited to emphasize themes of courage and dedication, while omitting details that might have traumatized children who were still processing their own experiences with violence and loss. Her accounts of battles fought and comrades lost served educational purposes about the reality of a world where conflicts were resolved through force, while providing context for understanding why she valued peace and stability so highly. The arrival of Arlong and his fishman pirates in the waters around Kokoyasi village represented the kind of existential threat that Belamir had hoped her daughters would never have to face, yet her military training had prepared her to recognize the signs of systematic occupation and the implications such occupation would have for civilian populations who lacked means of effective resistance. The tribute system that Arlong established was designed not just to extract wealth, but to create psychological dependency that would make resistance seem futile even to those who possessed theoretical capability for fighting back. The calculation that every adult in the village was forced to make regarding their own survival versus their ability to protect family members revealed the cruel mathematics of oppression. The way that limited resources could be weaponized to force impossible choices between competing moral obligations. The sum demanded for each person's continued existence was carefully calibrated to be achievable for most but impossible for some, ensuring that the selection process would divide the community while demonstrating the arbitrary nature of life and death decisions under the new order. Belamir's assessment of their family's financial situation revealed the stark reality that her modest savings were insufficient to purchase safety for all three of them. The money she had accumulated through years of careful budgeting, falling short of the tribute required to ensure that her daughters could continue living in the only home they had known since their adoption. The calculations she performed and reperformed showed that no amount of creative accounting could bridge the gap between what she possessed and what Arlong's regime demanded. The choice that confronted her was simultaneously simple and impossible: save herself and abandon her daughters to whatever fate awaited those who could not pay, or sacrifice her own safety to ensure theirs, while accepting that such sacrifice would leave them orphaned in a world that had already proven its capacity for casual cruelty toward the innocent. The decision she ultimately made reflected not just maternal instinct, but fundamental understanding of what made life worth living. Recognition that existence without purpose was merely survival without meaning. The confrontation with Arlong's collectors was conducted with dignity that transcended the desperate circumstances that had created it. Belamir's military bearing evident, even as she explained that she could afford tribute for only 2 of the 3 lives in her household. Her calm acceptance of the implications of this shortfall demonstrated courage that went beyond physical bravery to encompass moral certainty about what constituted acceptable sacrifice and what represented unthinkable betrayal. The explanation she provided to Nami and Nojiko about her decision was crafted to help them understand that her choice represented love rather than abandonment, protection rather than rejection, investment in their future rather than surrender to despair. Her words were chosen to provide them with foundation for surviving the trauma they were about to experience, while maintaining their capacity for trust and hope, despite witnessing the destruction of their family structure. Arlong's execution of her sentence was conducted with the casual efficiency of someone for whom killing had become routine administrative task. His lack of ceremony or recognition of the significance of what was occurring serving to demonstrate the contempt he felt for human life and the ease with which he could destroy everything that others valued most deeply. The bullet that ended Belomir's life was fired not in anger or passion, but with the same indifference one might show toward eliminating any other inconvenience. The psychological impact of witnessing their adoptive mother's murder created trauma in both girls that would influence every subsequent decision they made. Nami's desperate attempt to earn enough money to buy back their village, reflecting both her inheritance of Belomir's protective instincts and her inability to accept that some losses could not be reversed through sufficient effort or sacrifice. The years she spent serving Arlong while secretly working toward liberation represented continuation of her mother's legacy through different means, the same willingness to endure personal degradation in service of protecting others. Nojiko's response to their family's destruction took different form, but reflected the same underlying values. Her decision to remain in Kokoyashi village and maintain the Tangerine Grove serving as living memorial to the woman who had saved them both, while providing anchor point for community members who needed reminder that resistance to oppression could take many forms. Her quiet defiance of Arlong's authority through small acts of preservation and remembrance demonstrated that some victories were achieved through persistence rather than dramatic confrontation. The Tangerine Grove that continued to produce fruit long after Belomir's death served as metaphor for the way that love could outlive the people who embodied it. Each season's harvest representing proof that investment in the future could achieve results, even when the investor was not present to witness them. The care that Nojiko lavished on the trees reflected understanding that maintaining her mother's legacy required more than memory. It demanded continued commitment to the values she had embodied and the purposes she had served. The story of Belomir's sacrifice became legend within Kokoyashi village, not because of its uniqueness, but because of how perfectly it exemplified the choice between self-preservation and protection of others that everyone faced under Arlong's rule. Her decision to pay for her daughters rather than herself serving as template for understanding what genuine love required when tested by impossible circumstances. The retelling of her final moments served educational purpose for community members who needed to understand that heroism was not always dramatic, but sometimes took form of quiet acceptance of necessary sacrifice. The influence that Belomir's example had on Nami's eventual development into someone capable of trusting others and accepting help reflected the delayed impact of lessons that had been taught through action rather than words. Her mother's demonstration of unconditional love providing psychological foundation that survived years of exploitation and trauma. The ability to eventually form bonds with the Straw Hat Pirates represented victory over forces that had tried to convince her that caring about others inevitably led to pain and loss. The memorial that the village eventually erected in Belomir's honor was simple marker, acknowledging someone who had embodied the best aspects of human nature while facing the worst circumstances that life could create. Yet its significance went far beyond recognition of individual virtue to encompass validation of principles that made survival worthwhile rather than merely possible. Her death had proven that some values were worth defending regardless of cost, that family bonds could transcend biological relationships, and that love expressed through sacrifice possessed power that outlasted the lives of those who embodied it. The legacy that Belomir left in the form of two daughters who had learned to embody her values while pursuing their own dreams represented multiplication rather than simple continuation of her influence. Each life she had saved going on to touch countless others through acts of compassion and courage that traced their origins to lessons learned in a small house overlooking tangerine groves. Her death had ensured that her love would continue to influence the world long after her personal story had ended. proving that some sacrifices achieved immortality through the lives they made possible. The warrior who would sacrifice himself for the dawn he would never see carried within his heart the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years of mink civilization, generations of knowledge about the delicate balance between survival and principle that had allowed his people to thrive on the back of an ancient elephant, while maintaining their connection to forces larger than any individual life. Pedro understood better than most that some moments in history demanded everything from those who were present to witness them, that the convergence of circumstances, which brought the Straw Hat Pirates to Whole Cake Island, represented opportunity that might not come again for centuries. The prophecies that had been passed down through mink oral tradition spoke of a dawn that would transform the world, yet these ancient words had remained abstract concepts until Pedro witnessed Luffy's arrival on Zoo and recognized in the young pirate captain something that transcended normal human ambition or capability. The joy that radiated from Luffy's interactions with his crew, the casual way he inspired loyalty and devotion in others, the absolute certainty with which he pursued goals that seemed impossible. All of these qualities aligned with descriptions of the figure who would herald the new age that mink elders had been anticipating since time immemorial. Pedro's own journey toward understanding his role in these unfolding events had been shaped by experiences that taught him both the value of patience and the recognition of moments when action became necessary, regardless of personal cost. His previous encounters with Big Mom had left him diminished in ways that went beyond the 50 years of lifespan she had claimed as tribute. The psychological impact of facing someone whose power operated according to principles that seemed to transcend normal understanding of what was possible in combat between mortal beings. The decision to join the Sanji retrieval mission was motivated not by simple desire for adventure or loyalty to new allies, but by recognition that this expedition represented his opportunity to serve purposes larger than his own survival or comfort, that the skills and experience he had accumulated during his lifetime were most valuable when deployed in service of goals that would benefit future generations rather than immediate personal interests. The knowledge that his remaining years were already numbered by Big Mom's previous intervention gave his commitment additional weight, the understanding that time was limited, making every action more significant. The infiltration of Whole Cake Island required Pedro to draw upon every aspect of his training as both warrior and scout, his natural abilities as a mink, enhanced by years of experience in situations where discovery meant death, and success depended upon perfect coordination between stealth and violence. The territory they were entering was not merely hostile but actively malevolent. Every tree and building animated by Big Mom's soul-based powers and programmed to detect and report the presence of intruders who lacked authorization to exist within her domain. The seducing woods that surrounded Big Mom's stronghold represented more than geographical obstacle. They were manifestation of power that transformed the natural world into extension of their ruler's will. Every path designed to confuse and mislead travelers, while every sound and movement was monitored by consciousnesses that existed solely to serve their creator's paranoid desire for absolute control. Navigation through such territory required not just physical skill but psychological resilience, the ability to maintain sense of direction and purpose when surrounded by forces designed to break down mental barriers between reality and illusion. Pedro's experience with similar challenges during his previous visit to Whole Cake Island provided crucial intelligence about the methods used to disorient intruders and the strategies that might prove effective in overcoming supernatural obstacles that could not be addressed through conventional combat techniques. His warnings to his companions about the specific dangers they would face reflected understanding earned through bitter experience about the price of underestimating an emperor's power within their own territory. The plan that emerged for their infiltration took advantage of Pedro's knowledge, while acknowledging the limitations imposed by changed circumstances and enhanced security measures that Big Mom had implemented since his last visit. The evolution of her defenses reflecting the same strategic thinking that had allowed her to maintain control over dozens of islands, despite constant challenges from rivals who coveted her position. The success of their mission would depend not just on avoiding detection, but on accomplishing their objectives with sufficient speed to prevent the mobilization of forces that would make escape impossible. The wedding ceremony that provided cover for their activities represented more than simple political alliance between powerful families. It was demonstration of Big Mom's ability to orchestrate events on scales that encompassed multiple nations, while serving her larger strategic objectives of consolidating power throughout the New World. The celebration that would provide distraction for their rescue operation was simultaneously expression of joy and display of strength, reminder to all present that crossing Big Mom carried consequences that extended far beyond immediate retaliation. Pedro's role in the mission evolved from simple reconnaissance to active participation in combat operations, as circumstances demanded greater risk-taking to achieve their objectives. His willingness to expose himself to danger, reflecting understanding that some purposes were worth any sacrifice, while his tactical decisions demonstrated wisdom gained through decades of experience in life or death situations. The techniques he employed drew upon traditional Mink combat arts, enhanced by personal innovations developed through his encounters with opponents whose power levels exceeded normal parameters. The escalation of conflict that followed their discovery transformed what should have been careful infiltration into running battle that tested every aspect of their preparation and training. The shift from stealth to open warfare requiring immediate adaptation to circumstances that bore little resemblance to their original plans. Pedro's experience in such fluid situations allowed him to serve as anchor point for companions who were struggling to adjust their strategies to meet evolving threats that seemed to multiply with each passing moment. The confrontation with Perospero represented convergence of personal history and present necessity. Pedro's recognition of the candy-based powers that had once posed such challenges, providing him with understanding of tactical approaches that might prove effective, while his awareness of his opponent's capabilities informed his assessment of what sacrifices might be required to create opportunities for his allies. The battle that ensued was conducted with full knowledge that victory might demand prices that survival could not justify. The realization that conventional combat would prove insufficient to overcome Perospero's abilities while simultaneously creating the diversion necessary for the Straw Hats' escape forced Pedro to confront the possibility that his most valuable contribution to their mission would be his final contribution, that the dawn he had spent his life preparing for might require his death to achieve. The decision that followed was made not in desperation, but with calm acceptance of mathematical realities that made personal survival incompatible with mission success. The explosives that Pedro had carried throughout their infiltration were intended as tools for creating diversions or eliminating specific obstacles, rather than weapons of last resort. Yet circumstances had evolved to a point where their most effective deployment required accepting that such deployment would eliminate their user along with their targets. The calculation he performed was both tactical and philosophical, the weighing of individual life against collective benefit that had defined heroic action throughout history. The final conversation Pedro held with his companions before implementing his ultimate strategy was conducted with serenity that reflected not resignation but acceptance of destiny that had been approaching throughout his entire adult life, his words chosen to provide reassurance rather than grief, while conveying essential information about the significance of what they were attempting to achieve. The smile that accompanied his farewell carried weight of someone who had found meaning in circumstances that might have driven others to despair. The confrontation with Perospero that preceded the explosion was brief but decisive. Pedro's attack, creating opening that allowed him to position himself for maximum impact, while his opponent's confidence in victory prevented recognition of the true nature of the threat until circumstances had progressed beyond the point where evasion remained possible. The Suite Commander's realization of what was about to occur came too late to prevent it, but early enough to understand that he was facing enemy whose commitment transcended normal considerations of survival. The explosion that followed was visible from distances measured in miles rather than yards. Pedro's sacrifice creating fireball that illuminated the entire region while generating shockwaves that disrupted Big Mom's carefully orchestrated plans for capturing the intruders who had dared to violate her territory. The destruction achieved through this single act created chaos sufficient to allow the Straw Hats escape, while demonstrating that even emperors could be challenged by individuals whose dedication exceeded their fear. The silence that followed the explosion carried weight that transcended its brief duration. The absence of Pedro's voice from communications, creating void that his companions felt with intensity proportional to their recognition of what his sacrifice had accomplished. The grief that began to emerge was immediately complicated by awareness that mourning would have to be deferred until they had reached safety, that honoring his sacrifice required completing the mission he had died to make possible. The impact of Pedro's death on his fellow Minks who witnessed it reflected understanding that they had lost not just individual warrior, but living connection to their people's history and aspirations, someone whose knowledge and experience represented irreplaceable link between past wisdom and future possibilities. The tears that fell were mourning not just for friend, but for all the potential contributions that had been eliminated along with his life. The strategic consequences of the explosion extended beyond immediate tactical advantages to encompass psychological impact on Big Mom's forces, the demonstration that intruders possessed both capability and willingness to inflict significant damage, serving notice that the Emperor's reputation for invincibility had been challenged in ways that demanded response. The injury inflicted upon Perospero would serve as permanent reminder that overconfidence in the face of determined opponents could carry costs that extended beyond temporary setbacks. The escape that Pedro's sacrifice made possible was accomplished not just through the chaos his explosion created, but through the inspiration his example provided to companions who found in his courage the motivation to push beyond their own limitations and fears. The techniques they employed, the risks they accepted, the coordination they achieved, all reflected understanding that failure would render his death meaningless, while success would transform it into victory that honored everything he had represented. The story of Pedro's final moments would spread throughout the Mink community on Zu as testament to the values that had sustained their civilization through centuries of isolation and challenge, his willingness to sacrifice himself for others, serving as contemporary example of principles that had guided their ancestors through similar trials. The retelling of his sacrifice would inspire future generations while providing context for understanding their own responsibilities to causes larger than individual survival. The dawn that Pedro had spoken of throughout his final mission would indeed come to pass, though not in the immediate aftermath of his death, but through the accumulation of changes that his sacrifice helped set in motion, each victory achieved by those he had protected, adding to momentum that would eventually transform the world in ways that aligned with ancient prophecies he had spent his life trying to fulfill. His death had planted seeds that would grow into forest of possibility. The memorial that would eventually be erected in his honor would serve not just as monument to individual heroism, but as reminder that some purposes were worth any sacrifice, that the dawn of new ages required individuals willing to surrender their place in the light to ensure that others could see it. Pedro had proven that death in service of worthy causes was not ending, but transformation, the conversion of individual existence into eternal influence that would guide others toward goals he would never live to see accomplished. The legacy he left behind was measured not in territories claimed or enemies defeated, but in possibilities preserved and futures protected. The knowledge that his sacrifice had created conditions under which the next generation could pursue dreams that would have been impossible without his intervention. The warrior who had given his life for the dawn had ensured that when that dawn finally came, it would shine on world, made better by his willingness to step into darkness so that others might walk in light. The child who would one day sacrifice his humanity to save another was born into slavery not through any crime or debt, but simply because his blood carried genetic markers that the world government had decreed made him property rather than person, his very existence serving as evidence of how arbitrary the boundaries between freedom and bondage could become when determined by those who possessed sufficient power to enforce their definitions of human worth. Bartholomew Kuma entered the world already condemned to a life of servitude, his buccaneer heritage marking him for exploitation before he drew his first breath or committed his first act of defiance against the system that claimed ownership over his body and soul. The tests that were performed on newborn slaves to determine their racial composition and potential value were conducted with clinical precision that disguised systematic cruelty as scientific methodology, each blood sample and genetic analysis serving to reduce human beings to categories and classifications that would determine every aspect of their future existence. Kuma's identification as a buccaneer triggered protocols that had been refined through centuries of experience in managing populations whose strength and resilience made them valuable as laborers, while their independence of spirit made them dangerous as potential rebels against established authority. The separation from his parents that occurred shortly after his classification represented standard procedure designed to prevent the formation of family bonds that might create emotional complications for both slaves and their parents. Masters, the systematic destruction of relationships serving to isolate individuals and make them more dependent upon whatever small kindnesses their captors might occasionally provide. The facility where young Kuma was taken specialized in the conditioning of children whose genetics suggested they would require special handling to transform them from potential threats into compliant tools. The training regimen that shaped Kuma's early childhood was designed not merely to develop his physical capabilities, but to break down his sense of individual identity and replace it with programmed responses that would ensure his usefulness while minimizing the risk that his strength could be turned against those who claimed ownership over him. Each day brought new lessons in obedience and submission, psychological conditioning that used both rewards and punishments to reshape a naturally independent spirit into something more suitable for a life of servitude. The stories that Kuma's father managed to share with him during brief stolen moments were not mere entertainment but acts of rebellion disguised as bedtime tales. The legends of Nika, the warrior of liberation, serving as coded messages about the possibility of freedom and the importance of maintaining hope even when circumstances seemed hopeless. These whispered narratives provided psychological sustenance that helped preserve essential aspects of Kuma's humanity, despite systematic efforts to eliminate everything that made him an individual rather than simply a particularly valuable piece of property. The execution of his father for the crime of singing about liberation represented Kuma's first direct confrontation with the absolute nature of the power that controlled every aspect of his existence. The casual murder, serving as demonstration that even the smallest expressions of defiance would be met with overwhelming response, designed to eliminate not just the specific act of rebellion, but any inclination towards similar behavior in the future. The world noble who ordered this killing treated it as minor administrative matter, the disposal of defective property rather than the murder of someone's parent. The native hunting competition that followed shortly after his father's death transformed what had been systematic oppression into recreational slaughter, the transformation of human beings into prey for the entertainment of those whose boredom required increasingly extreme diversions to maintain their interest. Kuma's selection as one of the targets reflected not personal animosity but simple convenience, his age and size making him suitable quarry for hunters who wanted sport rather than easy victory. The survival skills that Kuma developed during those hours of being hunted like an animal drew upon everything his father had taught him about the importance of endurance and the possibility of eventual escape, each moment of continued existence serving as small victory against forces that viewed his death as entertainment rather than tragedy. The techniques he employed to evade capture were not just tactical but psychological, the maintenance of hope and humanity in circumstances designed to reduce him to nothing more than frightened prey. The rescue that eventually came was not the result of mercy or justice, but simple economics, his survival value as trained labor outweighing his entertainment value as hunting target. Once the competition had served its purpose in amusing the world nobles who had organized it, the return to slavery that followed was experienced as relief rather than defeat. The recognition that life, however constrained, remained preferable to death, however dramatic or meaningful such death might appear to those who observed it from safe distances. The years that followed were marked by gradual growth in both physical strength and psychological resilience. Kuma's development into someone capable of surviving the most brutal treatment while maintaining essential core of identity that no amount of conditioning had been able to eliminate entirely. The work he was forced to perform was designed to utilize his growing strength while reinforcing his status as property, each task carefully structured to provide value to his owners while offering no opportunities for personal growth or satisfaction. The escape that eventually freed Kuma from slavery was accomplished not through individual heroism, but through the coordinated efforts of people who understood that liberation was meaningless unless it extended beyond personal circumstances to encompass systemic change that would prevent others from experiencing similar suffering. The revolutionary army that facilitated his freedom was motivated not by charity, but by recognition that someone with his experiences and capabilities could contribute significantly to their mission of transforming the world's political structures. The transition from slave to revolutionary required Kuma to reimagine his understanding of what freedom meant and how it could be protected, his personal experience with oppression providing foundation for commitment to causes that transcended individual benefit to encompass collective welfare. The training he received in revolutionary tactics and philosophy built upon skills he had developed through necessity while providing context that transformed survival techniques into tools for liberation of others who remained trapped in circumstances he had escaped. The relationship that developed between Kuma and Jewelry Bonnie began not as romance but as mutual recognition of people whose experiences with powerlessness had created shared understanding of what protection meant and what prices were worth paying to ensure that innocence could grow up free from the kinds of trauma that had shaped their own childhoods. Their love was built upon foundation of common purpose rather than simple attraction, each finding in the other someone whose commitment to creating a better world matched their own. The discovery of Bonnie's illness created crisis that tested every principle Kuma had developed about the relationship between individual welfare and collective responsibility, the recognition that someone he loved faced suffering. He was powerless to prevent challenging his faith in the possibility of meaningful change through revolutionary action. The medical condition that threatened her life operated according to rules that political transformation could not alter, diseases that required resources and expertise that existed only within systems he had dedicated his life to opposing. The negotiations that led to Kuma's agreement to participate in the Pacifista project represented perhaps the most difficult decision of his life, the choice between maintaining his principles and accepting a deal with forces he had spent years fighting in order to secure treatment for someone whose life had become more important to him than his own ideological purity. The world government's willingness to provide medical care in exchange for his participation demonstrated their recognition that some forms of leverage were more effective than simple threats or violence. The gradual transformation that began with his initial cybernetic modifications was designed to preserve his effectiveness as a weapon while systematically eliminating the personality traits and emotional connections that might interfere with his utility as a tool of government policy. Each surgical procedure removed additional aspects of his humanity, while installing programming that would ensure compliance with orders, regardless of what those orders might require him to do to people he had once considered friends or allies. The memory erasure that accompanied his physical transformation was perhaps more cruel than any torture he had endured as a slave, the systematic deletion of everything that had made him who he was, reducing him to a shell that maintained his appearance while lacking the consciousness that had given meaning to his existence. The process was designed to be gradual enough that he remained functional throughout the transition, while being complete enough that the final product would retain no trace of the revolutionary who had volunteered for this fate. The missions that Kuma was assigned during the intermediate stages of his transformation tested his remaining humanity by requiring him to act against people and causes he had once supported, each assignment carefully calculated to provide evidence of his reliability, while further degrading whatever resistance his original personality might offer to the programming that was increasingly defining his responses to external stimuli. The encounter with the Straw Hat Pirates at Thriller Bark represented one of the final expressions of Kuma's original personality. His decision to test Zoro's loyalty to his captain, reflecting values that had not yet been completely eliminated by the cyborg conversion process. The recognition he showed for the bonds that united Luffy's crew spoke to memories of similar relationships from his own past, connections that had provided meaning and purpose that purely mechanical existence could never replicate. The confrontation at Sabaody Archipelago marked the effective end of Bartholomew Kuma as an individual, his systematic elimination of the Straw Hat crew members, reflecting programming that had finally achieved dominance over whatever remained of his original consciousness. Yet even in this mechanized state, traces of his former self occasionally surfaced in the precision with which he executed his orders, the care he took to ensure that his targets were transported safely rather than simply destroyed. The final stages of his transformation were completed during the 2-year time skip, the remaining vestiges of his humanity systematically removed and replaced with purely mechanical responses that ensured absolute compliance with orders, while eliminating any possibility of independent action or moral judgment. The man who had once fought for liberation became a weapon that could be deployed against liberation movements without hesitation or regret. The revelation of his true relationship to Bonnie and the full extent of his sacrifice would eventually provide context for understanding the tragedy of his transformation, the knowledge that he had surrendered everything that made him human in order to preserve the life of someone whose existence gave his own life meaning. The deal he had made with the world government represented victory and defeat simultaneously, the successful preservation of one life at the cost of destroying another. The current state of Bartholomew Kuma, as mindless cyborg, represents one of the most complete victories that oppressive systems can achieve over individuals who challenge their authority, the transformation of a revolutionary into a tool of the very forces he had dedicated his life to opposing. His fate serves as warning about the prices that love can demand and the ways that compassion can be weaponized against those who possess it. The memory of who Kuma had been before his transformation was preserved not in his own consciousness, but in the hearts and minds of those who had known him as a revolutionary, their testimonies serving as witness to the humanity that had been sacrificed to serve someone else's survival. The story of his sacrifice would eventually inspire others, while serving as reminder that even the strongest individuals could be broken when the right pressure was applied to the right vulnerabilities. The cyborg who stood guard at Marie-Joie bore no resemblance to the father who had once sung songs of liberation to a sick child. Yet somewhere within the mechanical systems that had replaced his consciousness, traces of that love might still exist, waiting for circumstances that could reawaken what had been seemingly destroyed. The possibility of redemption remained theoretical but not impossible. Hope that existed despite overwhelming evidence that the man named Bartholomew Kuma had been effectively eliminated from existence. His legacy lived on, not in his transformed body, but in the life he had preserved through his sacrifice. Bonnie's continued existence serving as proof that love could achieve victories that revolution alone had failed to accomplish. The child he had saved would carry forward aspects of his character while pursuing her own path toward whatever future his sacrifice had made possible, ensuring that his humanity would survive even if he himself could not. The island of Ohara rose from the west blue like a monument to human curiosity and intellectual achievement, its massive tree of knowledge serving as both literal library and symbolic representation of humanity's eternal quest to understand the forces that shaped their world and the events that had defined their history. For centuries, this sanctuary of learning had attracted scholars from every corner of the globe. Individuals whose dedication to truth transcended national boundaries and political loyalties, united by shared conviction that knowledge was sacred and that the pursuit of understanding was among the highest callings to which human beings could dedicate their lives. The scholars who made their home beneath the tree's vast canopy were not mere academics, pursuing abstract theories for intellectual satisfaction, but dedicated researchers whose work sought to illuminate the darkest corners of history, to recover truths that had been deliberately obscured, and to preserve for future generations the accumulated wisdom of civilizations that might otherwise vanish without trace. Their commitment to scholarship went beyond professional obligation to encompass moral duty. The recognition that society's understanding of its past was essential to making informed decisions about its future. The ancient texts that filled the Tree of Knowledge represented more than simple historical records. They were testimonies to the dreams and struggles of countless generations who had sought to build better worlds for their descendants, chronicles of both triumphs and failures that could provide guidance for those who faced similar challenges in their own times. The careful preservation of these documents required not just physical protection from decay and damage, but intellectual courage to maintain their availability even when their contents challenged popular beliefs or official narratives. The poneglyphs that had become the focus of increasingly intense study represented the most tantalizing mystery in all of human scholarship. Stone monuments whose indestructible construction and indecipherable script suggested knowledge so important that their creators had taken extraordinary measures to ensure its survival across millennia. The few scholars who possessed the skills necessary to translate these ancient messages found themselves confronting information that challenged everything they thought they knew about the world's political development and the forces that had shaped current power structures. The research into the Void Century that had consumed the efforts of O'Hara's most brilliant minds was motivated not by idle curiosity, but by recognition that this mysterious period represented a crucial gap in human understanding. 800 years of history that had been systematically erased from official records in ways that suggested deliberate effort to conceal events of enormous significance. The implications of such systematic historical manipulation were profound, raising questions about the legitimacy of current institutions and the truthfulness of foundational narratives that justified existing power arrangements. Dr. Clover's leadership of the archaeological expedition that would ultimately seal O'Hara's fate reflected both his scholarly dedication and his understanding that some knowledge was too important to abandon simply because pursuing it might prove dangerous. His decision to continue research, despite increasingly obvious government opposition, representing commitment to principles that transcended personal safety considerations. The warnings he received about the risks involved in poneglyph research were acknowledged but not heeded. His belief in the fundamental right to pursue truth outweighing his concern for potential consequences. The gradual realization that their research was attracting unwanted attention from world government authorities created an atmosphere of increasing tension within O'Hara's scholarly community. Yet, rather than deterring continued investigation, official pressure seemed to validate their suspicions that they were approaching discoveries of extraordinary importance. The surveillance that began to surround the island was conducted with subtlety, designed to avoid confirming scholars' suspicions while gathering intelligence about the scope and implications of their research activities. The young Robin, who grew up surrounded by these scholarly pursuits, absorbed not just academic knowledge but understanding of the principles that motivated her mother's colleagues, the recognition that truth was worth pursuing regardless of obstacles, and that the preservation of knowledge was sacred duty that transcended individual safety considerations. Her exceptional abilities in deciphering ancient texts made her a valuable contributor to research efforts while simultaneously marking her as potential target for those who sought to control or eliminate such capabilities. The expedition that Dr. Clover organized to investigate recently discovered poneglyph sites represented culmination of decades of careful research and preparation. The assembled team, bringing together individuals whose combined expertise offered unprecedented opportunity to unlock secrets that had remained hidden since the Void Century. The departure of this expedition from O'Hara would prove to be more than scholarly journey. It was a step toward discoveries that would trigger responses from forces they had underestimated. The initial findings that the expedition reported back to O'Hara confirmed their most ambitious theories while revealing implications that exceeded even their most speculative projections. Evidence that the Void Century had witnessed events so significant that their suppression required ongoing effort by institutions whose power depended upon maintaining historical ignorance. The enthusiasm with which these discoveries were received by the scholars who remained on O'Hara reflected their understanding that they were witnessing a breakthrough moment in human understanding. The decision by world government officials to classify O'Hara's research as existential threat was based not on assessment of immediate military danger, but on recognition that knowledge they were uncovering could undermine the ideological foundations upon which current power structures were built. the revelation of historical truths that contradicted official narratives, posing challenges that could not be addressed through conventional diplomatic or economic pressure. The classification of archaeological research as threat to world peace represented unprecedented expansion of government authority into realm of pure scholarship. The Buster Call that was authorized against O'Hara represented most extreme response available to world government forces, military action typically reserved for situations where entire populations had rebelled against established authority or where foreign invasion threatened critical strategic locations. The deployment of such overwhelming force against civilian research facility demonstrated the level of threat that official analysis had attributed to scholarly activities that posed no immediate physical danger to anyone. The preparations for implementing the Buster Call were conducted with military precision that reflected years of planning for scenarios where complete elimination of target populations might prove necessary. Yet the specific circumstances that had triggered this particular operation were unprecedented in their focus on intellectual rather than military threats. The orders given to participating forces emphasized the importance of total destruction, leaving no survivors who might preserve or transmit the dangerous knowledge that O'Hara's scholars had uncovered. The arrival of the Buster Call fleet in O'Hara's waters marked beginning of systematic destruction that would eliminate not just individual lives, but entire civilization that had developed around pursuit of knowledge and preservation of historical truth, the targeting extending beyond immediate research facilities to encompass every aspect of scholarly infrastructure that had supported academic activities. The bombardment that followed was designed to ensure that nothing would survive that could serve as foundation for rebuilding similar scholarly community. The Tree of Knowledge itself became primary target not just because of its symbolic significance, but because of its practical function as repository for texts and documents that represented accumulation of centuries of scholarly work. The destruction of this library serving dual purpose of eliminating dangerous information while sending message about consequences that awaited others who might consider similar research activities. The flames that consumed countless irreplaceable volumes represented more than simple destruction of property. They constituted attack on human knowledge itself. Dr. Clover's final attempt to broadcast the truth they had discovered about the Void Century was conducted with understanding that this might represent last opportunity to share discoveries that had cost so many lives to achieve, his words carefully chosen to convey maximum information in minimum time, while hoping that someone, somewhere, might preserve what they had learned. The transmission that carried his voice beyond O'Hara's shores was cut short by gunfire, yet the fragments that escaped censorship would eventually reach audiences capable of understanding their significance. The civilian population that found itself caught in this scholarly controversy had little understanding of the research that had triggered such extreme response, their only crime being residents on island whose academic activities had attracted government attention. They could neither comprehend nor escape. The evacuation ships that were destroyed during their attempted escape demonstrated that official policy extended beyond elimination of scholars to encompass anyone who might have been exposed to dangerous knowledge, regardless of their actual involvement in research activities. Saul's decision to protect Robin despite his marine loyalties reflected recognition that some orders contradicted fundamental moral principles that no amount of military discipline could override. His realization that government he had served faithfully was capable of systematic murder of innocents, forcing him to choose between institutional loyalty and basic human decency. The injuries he sustained while facilitating her escape served as physical manifestation of torn loyalties and moral conflict that such circumstances created. The Ice Age attack that ultimately killed Saul was delivered not by enemy but by former colleague, whose commitment to following orders superseded his personal relationships and moral reservations. The execution demonstrating how thoroughly institutional loyalty could override individual conscience when sufficient pressure was applied. His final words to Robin about the importance of finding friends who would accept her carried weight of someone who understood that survival alone was insufficient without human connections that provided meaning and purpose. The escape that allowed Robin to survive O'Hara's destruction was accomplished not through her own efforts, but through sacrifices made by adults who recognized that preserving her life was more important than their own survival, their final acts representing validation of principles that had motivated their scholarly work throughout their careers. The boat that carried her away from Burning Island bore not just individual refugee, but living repository of knowledge that government forces had failed to eliminate completely. The bounty that was immediately placed on Robin's head reflected government recognition that their efforts to eliminate dangerous knowledge had been incomplete, her survival representing ongoing threat that required constant vigilance and pursuit regardless of her age or apparent harmlessness. The designation of 8-year-old child as criminal whose capture warranted significant reward demonstrated the paranoia that drove official response to scholarly activities they could not control. The psychological impact of witnessing entire civilization destroyed for pursuit of knowledge created trauma that would influence every subsequent decision Robin made about trust, relationships, and the value of preserving truth in a world that seemed determined to suppress it. The guilt she felt about being sole survivor was compounded by recognition that her continued existence made her target for forces that would not hesitate to destroy others who offered her protection or assistance. The years of isolation and fear that followed her escape from O'Hara were marked by constant awareness that forming attachments or revealing her true identity could result in death or disaster for anyone who became involved with her. The loneliness imposed by circumstances, creating psychological barriers that made genuine relationships seem both desperately desired and impossibly dangerous. Each temporary refuge that offered her sanctuary carried risk that accepting such help would bring destruction upon those who provided it. The knowledge that Robin carried with her represented more than personal burden. It was legacy of entire scholarly community whose dedication to truth had cost them their lives, responsibility that demanded preservation and eventual transmission despite personal risks involved in maintaining such dangerous information. The ability to read poneglyphs that had made her valuable to O'Hara's research efforts also made her target for those who either sought to exploit such capabilities or eliminate them entirely. The organizations that eventually sought to recruit Robin's services were motivated not by scholarly interest in historical truth, but by recognition that her abilities could provide access to information with potential strategic or economic value, their offers of protection contingent upon her willingness to use her knowledge in service of goals she might not share. The decisions she made about accepting such arrangements were colored by understanding that refusing might mean death, while accepting meant complicity in purposes that contradicted everything her mother's colleagues had represented. The world government's continued pursuit of Robin throughout her adult life reflected their assessment that knowledge she possessed remained sufficiently dangerous to justify whatever resources were required to eliminate it. Their inability to simply ignore sole survivor of O'Hara, demonstrating how thoroughly the destroyed island's research had challenged their authority. The agents who tracked her across multiple islands and organizations were motivated by conviction that her capture or death was essential to maintaining security of institutions they served. The eventual revelation that Robin's knowledge was crucial to understanding not just historical truth but ongoing political developments validated the fears that had motivated O'Hara's destruction, while proving that scholarly research her community had pursued was indeed as significant as they had believed. The world government's extreme response to academic activities had been proportionate to actual threat. Such activities posed to their continued authority and legitimacy. The memory of O'Hara's destruction served as constant reminder that pursuit of knowledge carried risks that extended beyond personal safety to encompass survival of entire communities, yet also demonstrated that some truths were sufficiently important that people would choose to die rather than abandon their investigation. The scholars who perished in flames they had inadvertently ignited through their research became martyrs to principle that understanding was worth any sacrifice required to achieve it. The tree of knowledge that burned on that terrible day had been more than library. It was symbol of human capacity to preserve and transmit understanding across generations, repository of wisdom that represented centuries of accumulated effort to comprehend forces that shaped their world. Its destruction eliminated not just information, but institution that had served as beacon for those who believed knowledge should be pursued, regardless of political considerations or personal cost. The ship that would become more than vessel, more than home, more than faithful companion in countless adventures, began her existence in the loving hands of craftsmen who understood that every plank and nail they placed carried the potential to support dreams that exceeded the boundaries of ordinary imagination. The Going Merry emerged from Syrup Village's modest shipyard, not as the most advanced or powerful vessel ever constructed, but as something far more precious, a creation born from friendship and offered with the kind of generosity that transformed simple wooden construction into vessel, capable of carrying hopes as well as cargo across the most dangerous waters in the world. Kaya's decision to commission the Merry as gift for Luffy and his crew reflected understanding that true friendship required not just emotional support but practical assistance, the recognition that dreams of adventure needed tools capable of transforming aspiration into reality. The specifications she provided to the shipwrights were based not on technical expertise, but on intuitive understanding of what would be required to support people whose ambitions extended far beyond the familiar waters of their home village, each design element chosen to serve purposes she could envision, even if she could not fully comprehend. The figurehead that gave the ship her name was carved with attention to detail that went beyond mere craftsmanship, to encompass emotional investment in the success of those who would depend upon its protection, the cheerful ram's head serving as permanent reminder that even the most serious endeavors could be approached with joy rather than grim determination. The smile that adorned the Merry's prow would become symbol of optimism that could sustain crew members through trials that might otherwise have broken their spirit, evidence that happiness was not luxury but necessity for those who chose to chase impossible dreams. The early days of the Merry's service with the Straw Hat Pirates were marked by the kind of mutual adaptation that characterized all successful relationships. Ship and crew learning each other's capabilities and limitations, while developing trust that would prove essential during the increasingly dangerous adventures that lay ahead. Each successful voyage strengthened bonds between vessel and occupants, the Merry's reliable performance creating confidence that allowed her crew to attempt increasingly ambitious expeditions into waters where lesser ships might have failed catastrophically. The battles that the Merry witnessed and survived during their journey through the East Blue served as initiation into the realities of pirate life. Each cannon blast and sword clash that occurred upon her deck, adding to accumulation of memories that seemed to imbue the ship with consciousness that transcended her status as inanimate object. The blood that was spilled in her defense, the tears that were shed during moments of loss, the laughter that echoed through her chambers during celebrations. All of these contributed to transformation of wooden construction into something approaching living entity. The transition from East Blue to Grand Line represented more than geographical change. It marked beginning of challenges that would test every aspect of the Mary's construction and endurance. Waters where survival depended not just upon sailing skill, but upon vessels' ability to withstand conditions that operated according to rules unknown in more civilized seas. The log pose that began guiding their navigation reflected understanding that conventional methods were insufficient for waters where magnetic fields shifted according to principles that defied rational explanation. Reverse Mountain provided the Mary's first real test of her seaworthiness under extreme conditions, the impossible currents that carried her skyward toward clouds, demonstrating that she possessed resilience necessary to survive. Phenomena that would have destroyed vessels designed according to purely practical considerations. The joy that Luffy expressed during their ascent seemed to transfer itself to the ship, her timbers creaking with what sounded remarkably like shared excitement at experiencing something unprecedented in maritime history. The encounters with Laboon, the giants of Little Garden, and the various challenges of Drum Island each added layers to relationship between ship and crew, the Mary's faithful service during increasingly dangerous situations, creating bonds that went beyond simple utility to encompass genuine affection. Her crew members began to speak of her not as possession but as family member whose welfare was as important as their own, their concern for her condition reflecting understanding that she was more than transportation, but integral part of their collective identity. Alabaster's desert warfare and the massive conflicts that erupted across that kingdom tested the Mary's versatility as more than ocean-going vessel. Her transformation into base of operations for complex military campaign demonstrating adaptability that exceeded her original design specifications. The repairs that became necessary following these adventures revealed both her vulnerability and her remarkable capacity for recovery when tended by people who understood her needs and appreciated her contributions to their shared success. The Sky Island adventure that carried them to heights where normal ships were never meant to travel pushed the Mary beyond every reasonable expectation of what wooden vessel could accomplish. Yet somehow she not only survived, but seemed to thrive in conditions that challenged basic assumptions about physics and engineering. The modifications that became necessary for high-altitude sailing were accepted with grace that suggested she welcomed challenges rather than merely enduring them, her performance exceeding what her crew had any right to expect. Water 7's shipwrights delivered diagnosis that struck the crew like physical blow, their professional assessment revealing damage that went beyond cosmetic wear to encompass structural failures that threatened the ship's basic integrity. The keel damage they identified was not mere inconvenience, but fundamental compromise that made continued sailing increasingly dangerous with each voyage. Yet accepting their recommendation meant abandoning friend whose loyalty had never wavered, despite years of increasingly difficult service. The conflict between Luffy and Usopp that erupted over the Mary's fate reflected deeper issues about loyalty, practicality, and the painful recognition that love sometimes required making decisions that felt like betrayal, choices that prioritized long-term welfare over short-term emotional comfort. Usopp's identification with the ship's perceived worthlessness created psychological crisis that transformed practical decision into existential question about his own value to crew he desperately wanted to remain part of. The duel that followed was conducted not just between captain and sniper, but between competing philosophies about duty and sentiment, rationality and emotion, leadership and friendship that had no easy resolution, regardless of which perspective ultimately prevailed. Each blow struck during their combat carried weight of accumulated frustrations and fears that went far beyond immediate question of ship replacement. to encompass fundamental questions about what it meant to be family, when family included both people and vessels whose needs might conflict. The Going Mary's final voyage to save her crew from Eni's lobby represented miracle that defied every prediction about her structural integrity and seaworthiness, her impossible appearance at precisely the moment when salvation was needed most suggesting consciousness and will that transcended normal understanding of what ships could accomplish. The effort required for this last rescue clearly exhausted reserves of strength she had been husbanding for such crucial moment. Her subsequent collapse following pattern of heroic sacrifice rather than mechanical failure. The manifestation of her clobortamine during their final voyage provided visible proof of what her crew had suspected throughout their adventures together, that their ship had developed spirit that was as real as any human soul, consciousness born from love, and shared experience that had transformed wood and metal into something approaching living entity. The voice that spoke to them carried weight of accumulated memories and emotions that had been building throughout their time together. The conversation that followed between ship and crew was perhaps more emotionally devastating than any battle they had fought. The Mary's expression of gratitude for their care and her acknowledgement that their time together was ending, creating a moment of loss that seemed to encompass every relationship they had ever valued. Her apology for not being able to carry them further reflected understanding of duty and service that shamed human beings who considered themselves more evolved than supposedly inanimate objects. The funeral that they conducted for their beloved ship was arranged with ceremony befitting family member rather than discarded property, the Viking burning serving as both practical disposal method and ritual acknowledgement of bonds that death could not destroy, even when applied to beings whose existence operated according to principles they did not fully understand. The flames that consumed her hull seemed to release, rather than destroy, the spirit that had animated her service to their cause. The tears that fell during the Mary's cremation were expressions of grief that transcended normal categories of loss, mourning for friend whose loyalty had been absolute and whose sacrifice had enabled their survival and continued pursuit of dreams that she would never see fulfilled. Each crew member's individual response to her death reflected their personal relationship with vessel that had been home, protection, and companion throughout the most formative period of their shared adventure. The Going Mary's legacy lived on not just in memories, but in lessons about the nature of loyalty, sacrifice, and the ways that love could transform even the most ordinary objects into extraordinary beings, capable of acts that exceeded every reasonable expectation of their capabilities. Her example provided template for understanding how devotion and care could create consciousness where none had existed before, proving that family was defined by commitment rather than biology or conventional categories of existence. The replacement vessel that would eventually become their new home carried forward some aspects of the Mary spirit while developing its own personality and capabilities. Yet the comparison between ships served mainly to emphasize how unique their relationship with the Going Mary had been. Her death marked end of childhood phase of their adventure, while preparing them for challenges that would require different kinds of strength and different forms of protection than she had been able to provide. The story of the Going Mary's service and sacrifice became legend among pirates who understood that ships could be more than transportation, that vessels blessed with proper care and appreciation could develop loyalty that exceeded what any amount of money could purchase. Her example inspired others to treat their own ships with greater respect while providing proof that remarkable things could be achieved when people recognized that consciousness could emerge in places where it was least expected. The Clobortaman that had inhabited the Going Mary served as reminder that maritime tradition contained wisdom about relationships between sailors and vessels that modern understanding had largely forgotten, ancient recognition that ships developed souls when they were loved properly and treated as partners rather than possessions. Her manifestation validated beliefs that many had dismissed as superstition, while proving that some mysteries were based in realities that transcended conventional explanation. The impact of losing the Going Merry extended beyond immediate grief to encompass growth in the crew's understanding of mortality and the precious nature of relationships that could not be taken for granted simply because they had proven reliable in the past. Her death taught lessons about appreciation and gratitude that no amount of academic instruction could have provided, demonstrating through direct experience that love required constant attention and care rather than simple assumption that cherished things would remain available indefinitely. The memory of their first ship's sacrifice would influence every subsequent decision about vessel maintenance and crew relationships, her example serving as permanent reminder that neglect could destroy even the strongest bonds, while proper attention could create connections that transcended normal boundaries between living and inanimate. The Going Merry had proven that consciousness was not limited to biological forms, that spirit could emerge wherever love and dedication created conditions that supported such development. The final image of the Going Merry burning against the evening sky remained etched in her crew's collective memory as symbol of love that had achieved immortality through sacrifice, proof that some relationships could survive even death when they were built upon foundations solid enough to support transformation from physical presence to eternal influence. Her death had not ended their connection but changed its nature, converting direct interaction into inspiration that would guide future decisions and remind them always of what devotion could accomplish when properly directed. And so we close this chronicle of endings that were truly beginnings, of deaths that sparked more life than any birth. Each soul we've honored tonight understood a fundamental truth: that some things are worth dying for, and that death itself cannot destroy the dreams and love that define us. Their sacrifices ripple across the seas still, inspiring new dreamers, new heroes, new hopes for a world worth fighting to protect. Rest now, gentle listener, and let their courage comfort you through the darkness. In the grand tapestry of existence, these deaths were not endings but eternal flames, lighting the way for those brave enough to carry their torches forward. The ocean remembers every soul it has claimed, and in remembering, keeps their spirits alive forever. May their peace become your peace, their strength your strength, and their dreams a gentle guide into the deepest, most restorative sleep. The fallen heroes watch over us still, and in our dreams, perhaps we'll hear their voices whispering that every ending is just another beginning waiting to unfold.